Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. We'll now begin with story 1, the medieval bathhouse, communal cleanliness or den of sin. The image of a filthy, lice-ridden medieval peasant is so popular in fact, that you might assume soap was as rare as dragons in the Middle Ages. Yet here you are, in the heart of 12th century France, in a small town watching smoke curl from the chimney of a stew. That's what they called the bathhouse. It's early morning, and soon the bathhouse will open its doors to customers who want to wash, chat, and maybe even negotiate a tryst. Yes, bathhouses weren't just about cleanliness, they were complex social spaces, balancing hygiene and scandal. You might think the medieval world was a stranger to water. In truth, people bathed sometimes frequently, but the practice was as varied as the many small kingdoms and principalities that dotted medieval Europe. The role of public baths. Public bathhouses were common in larger towns by the 11th century. The concept had trickled down from Roman traditions and persisted, especially in places like Italy and southern France. Though most Roman aqueducts had crumbled by this time, the idea of heated communal baths lingered like steam in a cold window. These bathhouses weren't exactly luxurious spas. Picture instead a large timber-framed room, walls lined with wooden tubs. A roaring fire kept water warm in a massive copper cauldron. Bathers would ladle the hot water into their tubs. Sometimes they shared. Men and women often bathed together in earlier centuries, though this began to shift over time. Some cities even issued bans on mixed bathing by the 14th century, though it wasn't always enforced. In places like Paris, Cologne, and London, bathhouses became a regular part of life. People paid a small fee to bathe and could rent towels, soap, and occasionally, companionship. In some towns, bathhouses even offered food and drink, boiled chicken, ale, and bread while you soaked. For many, it was a break from the grime and an affordable pleasure. Cleanliness as a sign of morality. To medieval thinkers, physical cleanliness was often linked to spiritual purity. This wasn't just symbolic. Monks, especially those in orders like the Benedictines, were required to bathe regularly, not daily, but often enough to be noticed. Rules specified weekly or bi-weekly washings. In contrast, the poor urban worker might wash far less frequently, not out of preference, but practicality. Still, bathing was seen as beneficial. Medieval medical theory, drawn from the ancient works of Galen and Hippocrates, emphasized balancing bodily humors. Bathing, especially in warm water, was thought to open the pores and allow bad humors to escape. It was also advised before bloodletting, and physicians might prescribe mineral baths to treat illnesses ranging from gout to melancholy. But not everyone trusted the stews. Church authorities often warned about the risks of temptation. A bathhouse could be a slippery slope literally and morally. Prostitutes often worked from bathhouses, and some bathhouse owners rented space for illicit meetings. In cities like London, bawdy houses and bathhouses often occupied the same streets. This blurred line between bathing and brothel tarnished the bathhouse's reputation over time. Soap and supplies. Soap existed, though not as a floral-scented bar wrapped in plastic. Early soap was made from animal fat and ash, often mixed with herbs for scent. The quality varied. Some soap stung the skin. Wealthier citizens might import better soap from places like Castile in Spain, known for olive oil-based soap that was far gentler. In towns, soap making was a trade. Soap makers were sometimes considered suspect due to the smell of boiling fat wafting from their workshops, but they served a crucial role. In fact, by the 13th century, cities began regulating soap production to ensure standards. Bathers used small linen cloths to scrub, along with wooden-handled tools to reach the back. Hair washing was less frequent, perhaps once a month or less. Hair was often covered, especially by women, and lice combs were common. Hot water did little to kill lice, but combs and vinegar rinses helped. Who was bathing? Not everyone had access to bathhouses. Rural peasants often relied on rivers or simple basins in the home. Bathing outdoors was more common in warmer seasons. In winter, they might not bathe for months, but there's little evidence that they were entirely unconcerned with cleanliness. In some households, Saturday night was washing night. A large basin was placed by the hearth, filled with warmed water, and family members took turns. The youngest might go first, the oldest last. It was an effort, and often reserved for special occasions or feast days. Knights and nobles had bathing chambers built into castles. These were not everyday luxuries. Water had to be hauled, heated, and poured. Still, for important occasions, a warm bath was essential. Before a wedding, a knight might be ceremonially bathed to represent purity. Before a coronation, a king might be washed by attendants in a gilded basin. When bathing was dangerous. Despite its popularity, bathing came with risks. Many medieval physicians warned against overbathing, especially in winter. They believed open pores could allow disease to enter the body. After the arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, this belief intensified. Steam-filled rooms were seen as breeding grounds for miasmas, poisonous airs thought to carry disease. Some cities began closing bathhouses during plague outbreaks. Others blamed the stews for spreading sin and sickness. Over time, the reputation of bathhouses eroded, particularly in Northern Europe. In Protestant countries, especially during the Reformation, public bathing was increasingly associated with vanity and immorality. Still, in much of the medieval world, from the Islamic bathhouses of Cordoba to the thermal springs of Bath, the practice persisted. Some continued to bathe out of necessity, others for comfort, and some simply enjoyed the rare warmth of water in a cold and drafty world. But here's a question to leave you with. If bathhouses were once so popular and widespread, what truly caused their decline in later centuries? Disease, morality, or something else entirely? As the 14th century advanced, the warm glow of the medieval bathhouse began to flicker. What had once been a space for physical refreshment, medical treatment, and even spiritual cleansing was now at the center of moral, medical, and municipal controversies. By the mid-1300s, a darker cloud loomed over these once respected institutions, and it wasn't just steam. It was suspicion and fear. Let's return now to the streets of London, Paris, or Cologne. The familiar sign of the bathhouse, a pole with a cloth or leaves, still flutters in the breeze. But there's a growing discomfort among the citizenry. Behind these timbered doors, once a sign of civilized cleanliness, rumors now circulate. Whispers of illicit meetings, moral decay, and disease. What happened? The Black Death and the crisis of trust. The year 1347 marked a seismic shift in Europe's relationship with cleanliness. The arrival of the Black Death not only took millions of lives, it also rewrote assumptions about health and hygiene. Previously, many believed that opening the pores through warm bathing allowed bad humors to exit the body. But during the plague years, new fear took root, that those same open pores allowed bad air miasmas into the body. The connection between crowded public baths and plague outbreaks may have been coincidental, but in the absence of germ theory, it was enough to spark panic. Municipal authorities, often under pressure from clergy and physicians alike, began shutting down bathhouses. In some cases, bathhouses were repurposed into plague hospitals. In others, they were simply boarded up. The cheerful act of communal bathing had turned, in public imagination, into a dangerous gamble with death. Yet not everyone stopped bathing. In warmer climates, such as southern Italy and parts of the Iberian Peninsula, bathing traditions persisted longer, especially under the influence of Islamic hygiene culture. In Muslim Spain, public bathhouses hammams remained integral to daily life and religious practice. These were gender-separated and highly structured, emphasizing ritual purity. In contrast, in Northern Europe, the shift toward suspicion and abstention grew stronger by the year. the church and the morality of cleanliness. Even before the plague, the church had a complicated relationship with bathhouses. While monks were expected to bathe regularly, and clergy sometimes frequented bathhouses themselves, public bathing was often linked to sexual impropriety. In the eyes of reform-minded clergy, mixed-gender bathing was especially dangerous. Cities like Nuremberg attempted to regulate bathhouse behavior through civic ordinances. Rules were posted forbidding indecent conduct, unchaperoned women, or lewd behavior. Enforcement, however, was inconsistent. Clerical texts from the 14th and 15th centuries increasingly cast bathhouses in a suspicious light. Confessors were warned to question penitents about bathhouse visits. Were they merely bathing or something more? In some cities, bathhouses were licensed to operate as honest establishments, while others became thinly veiled brothels. The overlap between washing and sex work became a political and moral problem. Some bathhouse workers even operated as unofficial matchmakers or courtesans. The line between hospitality and harlotry blurred. This moral panic didn't completely erase bathing culture, but it reshaped it. Private bathing at home, with servants heating water, became more fashionable among the wealthy. Public bathing became increasingly associated with the lower classes and with suspicion. Regulations and public perception. Municipalities across Europe developed detailed regulations to manage bathhouses. These documents offer a fascinating and often forgotten window into daily life. For instance, in 15th century Frankfurt, bathhouse operators were required to maintain separate hours for men and women, provide clean linen for each customer, boil and replace water between customers, serve food only in designated eating areas. Yet these rules were often ignored. Water was reused, towels were not always laundered, and enforcement was lax. Complaints about lice, filth, and noise became common. Bathhouses, once seen as a place of rejuvenation, were now a site of contention. The bathhouse became the subject of satire in contemporary literature. In The Ship of Fools, 1494, German author Sebastian Brandt mocked the vanity and foolishness of those who frequented stews, suggesting they were places of vice and foolish pride. Similarly, illustrations from the period often portrayed bathhouses as raucous and disorderly. In England, bathhouses along the Thames, known as the stews of Southwark, were legally tolerated yet regulated as brothels. Owned by the Bishop of Winchester, they were taxed and monitored, with regulations posted at the door. Yet these rules rarely prevented immoral activity, further blending the association between bathing and sin. Hygiene in decline, or just hidden. By the end of the 15th century, the public bathhouse in Northern and Central Europe had largely lost its reputation for respectability. But does that mean people stopped bathing altogether? Not quite. Instead, hygiene moved indoors, or more often into buckets. Households increasingly relied on small-scale private washing. People washed hands and faces daily, and partial baths known as dry bathing or sponge baths became more common. Towels, linen shifts, and fragrant herbs were used to freshen the body. The upper classes might bathe in portable wooden tubs, often surrounded by screens and heated bricks. More attention was paid to changing linen than to full-body washing. Clean undergarments were believed to absorb sweat and oils, keeping the body fresh. Hence, laundering became central to personal hygiene. A clean shirt, rather than a clean body, became the marker of civility. Travelers and pilgrims often carried their own soap and cloths. Bathing on the road was harder but not impossible. Inns occasionally offered bathing facilities, but in general, bathing shifted from being a public act to a personal, discreet one. It's important to remember, the decline of the bathhouse was not the same as the decline of hygiene. It was, rather, a shift in where and how cleanliness was practiced, shaped by fear, fashion, and theology. The fall of the stew. By the early 1500s, many of the great public bathhouses of Europe had shuttered. Some were converted into homes, hospitals, or shops. Others simply decayed. The once vibrant culture of communal bathing had collapsed under the weight of disease, distrust, and doctrine. In its place rose a new model of cleanliness, less visible, more private, and more anxious. Gone were the days of laughter echoing from steamy timber halls. In their place was a growing obsession with smell, modesty, and appearances. And yet, one must ask, if public bathhouses were truly driven into extinction, how did bathing return with such force centuries later, especially during the Enlightenment and beyond? By the dawn of the 16th century, the once humming bathhouses of medieval Europe had grown quieter. The clang of wooden tubs being filled, the murmur of conversation rising above the steam, and the scent of boiling herbs and soap, these sounds and smells began to vanish from cities like London, Bruges, and Vienna. Where bathhouses remained, they often served niche purposes, as hospitals, brothels, or slowly decaying civic relics. For many, the bathhouse had become a memory, one that smelled more of sin than of soap. So how did the tide turn so completely? What historical forces led to the long retreat from public bathing, and what would eventually bring it back? The Protestant Reformation, a cleansing of a different kind. One of the most powerful cultural forces to reshape European life in the 16th century was the Protestant Reformation. Though Martin Luther and other reformers didn't campaign explicitly against bathing, their teachings contributed to the bathhouse's decline by reshaping attitudes toward the body, pleasure, and public morality. Where Catholicism had long permitted a certain tolerance for sensuality, albeit under tight control, Protestant leaders in places like Germany, England, and Switzerland emphasized spiritual purity over bodily indulgence. The bathhouse, long associated with temptation and leisure, stood in opposition to these new ideals. In Geneva, John Calvin's reformed government outlawed prostitution, gambling, and excessive public merriment, including mixed-gender bathing. The bathhouse became a casualty of a broader push toward public discipline. Where once people had gathered to wash and converse, now they faced fines or even imprisonment. In England, Henry VII's dissolution of the monasteries removed one of the few institutional supporters of bathing. Monks and friars, who had maintained rudimentary bathhouses within cloisters, were dispersed. These buildings were sold or repurposed, and the quiet continuation of monastic hygiene largely disappeared. Across Northern Europe, public bathing became associated with Catholic decadence or urban corruption. The bathhouse faded from respectability, its reputation drowned in theological suspicion. A medical shift from cleanliness to cold. Just as theology played a role, so too did medicine. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, a medical debate raged. Was bathing healthful or harmful? Earlier medieval physicians, still operating under Galenic theory, had argued that opening the pores with warm water allowed for the release of harmful humors. But with the rise of Renaissance medical thought and a growing emphasis on the dangers of air and temperature, new fears took root. Physicians began to argue that water itself could be dangerous. Once the skin's pores were opened by warm water, the body became vulnerable, not only to miasma, but to chill. And since cold air was considered a major cause of illness from colds to deadly fevers, bathing was increasingly viewed as medically risky. Many doctors recommended dry cleaning methods instead. The frequent changing of linen, the dusting of powders, the use of scented cloths or herbs to lift impurities. It wasn't that people suddenly became filthier, rather, they changed what they believed constituted cleanliness. A clean person, in the eyes of a 17th century noble, might be someone who changed their shirt daily but hadn't taken a full-body bath in months. Bathing moves indoors and behind walls. While public bathhouses faded, private bathing didn't disappear, it evolved. Wealthy households across Europe began constructing small, personal bathing rooms. These weren't modern bathrooms, but they might include a copper tub, a fire for heating water, and perfumed towels. Servants, especially women, would assist with heating and pouring water. In some courts, such as that of Louis XIV, bathing was a carefully orchestrated ritual. Yet even the Sun King rarely bathed in water. His hygiene routine was more focused on perfumes, powders, and linen. Still, the notion of cleanliness never fully left the upper classes. They simply redefined it. The poor, on the other hand, continued to rely on rivers, barrels, and seasonal washes practices shaped more by availability than philosophy. In rural areas, the occasional bath might still take place in a tub by the hearth, but without communal bathhouses and lacking medical encouragement, full bathing became rarer. As urban infrastructure declined in many areas during the 17th century, even basic sanitation suffered. Persistence in the South and East. It's worth noting that not all of Europe abandoned bathing so readily. In the Islamic-influenced parts of southern Spain and the Balkans, hammams continued to operate. These bathhouses maintained gender separation and emphasized cleanliness as a religious obligation. Bathing in Islam was not merely medicinal, it was part of daily and ritual life. Ottoman cities like Istanbul maintained elaborate bathhouse networks well into the 18th century, often more advanced than their Western counterparts. Even in Christian parts of southern Europe, Naples, Seville, Lisbon, bathing held on longer, thanks in part to milder climates and cultural continuity. In these places, cleanliness remained not just a personal choice, but a civic and religious virtue. Soap, smell, and shifting sensibilities. As Europe transitioned from the Renaissance to the early modern era, soap production improved. Olive oil-based soaps from Castile and Marseille became luxury goods. Still, for most people, soap was used more on clothes than skin. A person might scrub a collar or hemline with lye soap, but not necessarily apply it to their body. Scented sachets were placed in garments. Herbs were sewn into sleeves. Mouth rinses with wine or vinegar were used in the absence of true dental care. Cleanliness became more about aroma and presentation than actual bodily washing. This is the world from which we get the infamous quote, often attributed, though likely falsely, to Queen Elizabeth I take a bath once a month whether I need it or not. While likely apocryphal, the sentiment reflects an era where bathing was no longer routine. In some places, personal hygiene even became a source of national comparison. The French mocked the English for their supposed stink. The English, in turn, accused the French of disguising filth with perfume. Everyone, it seems, smelled but differently. The long pause before the clean revolution. By the late 1600s, the great medieval bathhouses of Europe were almost entirely gone. A few lingered in cities like Prague or Budapest, but most were either abandoned or repurposed. Public bathing as a civic service had vanished from most of Western Europe. And yet, the seeds of a new hygiene movement were quietly being sown. Advances in plumbing, urban planning, and eventually germ theory would change everything. In the 18th and especially 19th centuries, cleanliness would once again be seen not just as a virtue, but a necessity for health, civility, and modern life. But that's a different story. Let's pause here with a thought. Was the bathhouse truly a casualty of morality and miasma, or was it sacrificed to make room for a new, more private, and more anxious relationship with the human body? Story 2. Water wells and worry. How towns managed drinking water. It's easy to take water for granted. Turn a tap and it flows clean, pressurized, safe. But in the medieval world, every sip was a gamble, not just because of the taste, but because of the uncertainty surrounding what might be lurking unseen within. Still, people drank. They had to. The human body doesn't go long without water. Step into a medieval town in the 12th century. The streets are narrow, cobbled, or muddy, and filled with the sound of animals, vendors, and the occasional clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Somewhere nearby, there's a well. You might see people lowering buckets, drawing water for cooking, cleaning, and brewing. But what you don't see, what no one sees, are the unseen dangers of this daily ritual. How did medieval towns manage their drinking water? And more importantly, how did they survive it? Life around the well. In most medieval towns, the well was the beating heart of the neighborhood. Usually located in the town square or near a major crossroads, it was a place of work, gossip, and daily routine. Drawing water wasn't just a task, it was an event, particularly for women, who were most often responsible for fetching and carrying. Wells varied greatly. Some were stone-lined and deep, reaching down to clean aquifers. Others were shallower and less secure, vulnerable to runoff, pollution, and infestation. The quality of a town's water depended as much on geology as on engineering. To prevent contamination, many wells had wooden or stone covers. Some had pulley systems or winches, others relied on brute strength. In larger towns, multiple wells served different neighborhoods, and in wealthier communities, private wells might even be dug inside courtyards. Still, even the best well was only as clean as the ground above it. Sources of water: wells, springs, and aqueduct remnants. Not all towns relied solely on wells. Some, especially in southern Europe, retained partial Roman infrastructure. In places like Rome, Arles, or Trier, remnants of ancient aqueducts still delivered water to public fountains or cisterns. Though often in disrepair, these systems sometimes allowed a lucky few to access flowing spring water. Elsewhere, natural springs were prized and fiercely protected. A spring-fed fountain might become the centerpiece of a village. Monasteries and noble estates were particularly skilled at diverting spring water into channels, using gravity and stonework to direct flow where needed. In northern Europe, where Roman aqueducts were rare or non-existent, ingenuity took a different form. Rainwater was sometimes collected from roofs and stored in large cisterns. This was more common in coastal towns or islands where fresh groundwater was scarce. But even in the best of situations, water was a resource requiring constant vigilance. What contaminated water looked like or didn't. The problem with bad water is that it often doesn't look bad. It might be clear, cool, and still deadly. Medieval people didn't know about bacteria, viruses, or waterborne parasites. They lacked microscopes and modern lab testing. What they did have was observation and folklore. Cloudy water, foul smell, strange color, these were clear warning signs. People learned to avoid wells that made them sick or tasted strange. But the absence of symptoms didn't guarantee safety. Moreover, many towns faced a growing sanitation problem. As populations increased, so did the amount of waste. Chamber pots were emptied into the street or alley. Livestock lived alongside humans. Rain carried filth into the soil and into shallow wells. In some towns, laws forbade people from washing clothes or dumping waste near wells, but enforcement was difficult. A neighbor upstream, unknowingly fouling a stream with animal remains or household refuse, could cause a bout of dysentery in homes downstream. And when sickness struck, people rarely blamed the water. Instead, they blamed bad air, moral failing, or divine punishment. Brewing, the accidental water purifier. Strangely, one of the safest ways to consume water in medieval towns wasn't to drink it plain at all, but to drink it brewed. Ale, beer, and weak fermented drinks were everyday staples. Brewed using boiled water and hops, or herbs, these drinks were microbiologically safer. The process of boiling killed many pathogens, and the alcohol, though often weak, added another layer of protection. This is why even children drank small beer, a very low-alcohol beverage that quenched thirst and provided calories. In fact, brewing was often a domestic chore, done in small batches and consumed within days. In monasteries, where brewing became more professionalized, the results were even better. Clean, consistent, and often stronger, monastic brews were prized. Some abbeys, like those in Flanders or Bavaria, became famed for their water management and fermentation skills. It's worth noting, however, that beer and ale were not seen primarily as water substitutes. People still drank water sometimes because they had no choice. But the widespread presence of brewed beverages certainly helped cities avoid even greater mortality. Water and social status. As with most things in the Middle Ages, access to clean water often depended on your place in society. The nobility could afford private wells or even spring-fed fountains within their estates. Castles were often built near rivers, with stone conduits bringing water into kitchens or cisterns. In some fortresses, like Château de Chinon in France, elaborate well shafts were carved deep into rock to access aquifers far below. Monasteries, too, were surprisingly advanced. The Cistercians, in particular, were brilliant hydraulic engineers. At places like Revolx Abbey in England or Fontenay in Burgundy, monks built water channels to power mills, irrigate gardens, and supply clean water for daily use. Lavatorium stone hand-washing basins were standard in refectories. In contrast, the urban poor made do with communal wells, riverbanks, or shallow hand-dug pits. When these failed or turned foul, they simply moved on to the next source. For them, water quality was often a matter of luck and adaptation. Interestingly, some charitable foundations or religious orders maintained public fountains. These were designed not only to provide water, but to serve as public goods, acts of mercy in a thirsty world. Carved with biblical figures or donor names, these fountains became civic symbols as well as lifelines. Engineering challenges and civic responses. Though primitive by modern standards, some medieval towns developed surprisingly complex water systems. In Bruges, for example, canals were dredged and managed to allow water flow through the city. While they later became stagnant, during their prime they provided water for animals, firefighting, and some domestic uses. In London, the Great Conduit completed in the 13th century channeled spring water from Tyburn into the city via lead pipes. The water flowed into public cisterns, from which people could draw or purchase water. It was a huge engineering achievement for its time, and represented one of the first organized efforts to supply clean water to an entire urban population. Other cities followed suit. Paris built aqueduct-like channels from nearby springs. Some Italian cities restored parts of Roman infrastructure. Still, these efforts were rare and expensive. Most towns remained dependent on a patchwork of wells, streams, and human labor. Yet for all this effort, danger always lingered. One bucket dropped too near a cesspit, one flood, one careless butcher discarding animal waste upstream, any of these could turn a healthy neighborhood into a center of disease. And so we end with a thought. In a world where people could neither see nor understand what made water dangerous, how did so many manage to survive at all? As towns across Europe swelled during the late Middle Ages, the same questions echoed from the slums of Paris to the alleys of Prague. Where is the clean water? Is it safe? And more urgently, why does it smell like that? Between the 14th and 15th centuries, water, once the silent background actor of medieval life, began to take center stage in the struggle for urban survival. The need for clean water clashed against the forces of overpopulation, poor sanitation, and medieval urban planning, or the lack thereof. The result was not just inconvenience, but crisis. We now enter a messier phase of medieval water history, when old methods failed under the pressure of expanding towns, and new dangers emerged from beneath the very streets people walked on. The impact of urban growth. By the early 1300s, many European towns had grown far beyond their original capacities. Originally built for populations in the hundreds or low thousands, cities like London, Florence, and Cologne were now home to tens of thousands. This explosive growth had an immediate impact on water sources. Wells that once served small neighborhoods were now expected to quench entire districts. Streams that once supplied fresh water were now clogged with waste. New neighborhoods, hastily built outside old town walls, lacked proper water infrastructure. People dug shallow wells near pigsties and privies, and as wood, stone, and thatch filled every available patch of land, space for proper drainage all but disappeared. More people meant more waste, but waste didn't disappear, it moved, often downward into the soil or across cobbled streets where it pooled and festered. And as water mixed with filth, it carried more than just a bad smell. The rise of civic water management and its limitations. City authorities began to respond somewhat. Civic records from the 14th century reveal increasing concern with public health, especially as plague outbreaks became more frequent. In Florence, a 1380 ordinance prohibited the washing of animal intestines near public fountains. In Paris, officials tried to fine butchers who dumped waste near the Seine. In Lubeck, council members ordered the deepening of wells and the repair of broken conduits, but enforcement was difficult. With limited personnel and inconsistent surveillance, many laws were ignored. The root problem wasn't just behavior, it was infrastructure. Most towns lacked anything resembling a sewer system. Instead, they relied on open gutters, called kennels, that ran down the center or sides of streets. These channels were meant to carry rainwater and minor waste out of town. But when it didn't rain, or when the volume of refuse overwhelmed the flow, the kennels became stagnant ditches. Water from nearby wells could easily become contaminated, especially in flatter regions where drainage was poor. Some towns experimented with cesspits and soakaways, pits dug to collect liquid waste, but these were often unlined and located dangerously close to wells. Others, like Bruges and Ghent, turned to canals, but without regulation, these too became foul-smelling hazards. Contamination and its consequences. Medieval people lacked germ theory, but they weren't entirely ignorant. They knew that some water made you sick. They understood, albeit imperfectly, that clean water was linked to health. That's why many townsmen and women tried to draw water from running streams or deep wells when possible. Still, knowledge didn't always translate into action. Poorer residents, especially in densely packed tenements, often had no choice but to use the nearest available water even if it was suspect. The consequences were grim. Diarrhea, dysentery, and other waterborne illnesses were constant threats. Outbreaks of bloody flux, likely amoebic dysentery, ravaged city populations. Infant mortality was especially high, and the causes were rarely identified correctly. Ironically, in some towns, public fountains were safer than private wells, but not everyone had access. In cities like Siena and Nuremberg, large civic fountains or cisterns were built to deliver spring water to central locations. These were often beautifully decorated, emphasizing the importance of water as a symbol of civic pride. But they were also frequently monopolized by elites or religious institutions. And then there were the floods. When rivers overflowed, as they often did, entire streets were submerged. Animal dung, human waste, and spoiled food floated together. Wells near the banks were contaminated, but since clear water was still drawn from them, the danger went unnoticed. People drank, and then they died. Coping mechanisms and risk avoidance. So how did people manage? They coped. They learned to avoid certain wells after heavy rains. They listened to neighbors' gossip. That house drank from the far well and lost 2 children. They watched animals. If dogs or horses refused to drink from a source, so did they. Water was sometimes cleansed with wine or vinegar. Herbal infusions, including rosemary or sage, were thought to improve water safety. These methods may have added flavor and scent more than sanitation, but they provided psychological comfort. Others turned to water alternatives. As mentioned in Section 1, small beer remained a staple. Herbal ales, meads, and lightly fermented drinks continued to offer a safer, if slightly intoxicating, hydration source. In wealthier homes, water was sometimes filtered through cloth or stored in clay jars with charred wood or herbs. Again, the effectiveness was minimal, but the intent showed awareness that some water was dangerous. Water politics and property rights. As towns expanded, water became not only a necessity but a legal battleground. Who owned the rights to a stream? Could a neighbor dig a new well without affecting yours? What happened if someone built a tannery, an infamously smelly and polluting business next to your spring? These questions filled the records of town councils and courts. In London, for instance, disputes over access to conduits were common. Some residents tried to bribe water carriers to deliver extra loads, others stole from fountains at night. Fines were issued, conflicts escalated. Water was no longer free, nor even always public. In some towns, powerful families controlled certain springs and sold water at a profit. In extreme droughts, fights broke out. In drought years, women at wells quarreled or came to blows over drawing order and accusations of hoarding. Medieval towns were often close-knit communities, but water scarcity tested those bonds. Monastic and noble solutions. While the towns struggled, some of the era's best water systems remained behind monastery walls or castle gates. Monasteries like those of the Cistercians maintained carefully protected springs. Water was channeled to kitchens, washrooms, and fish ponds. These systems were quiet marvels of hydraulic engineering, and because the population was small and rules were strict, contamination was rare. Noble estates, too, often featured piped water, stone cisterns, or tiled channels, especially in southern Europe. While not available to the masses, these innovations showed that the technology did exist. It was simply a question of cost, maintenance, and political will. The contrast between clean water within the abbey and filth in the surrounding village must have been stark. One wonders if the townsfolk envied the cloistered monks not for their prayers, but for their fountains. By the mid-15th century, the water crisis of medieval towns had reached its peak. Infrastructure crumbled under urban pressure. Disease followed. Yet amid the hardship, a curious tension grew. People were starting to care. About water, about sanitation, about public health. In whispers and ordinances, in court cases and complaints, we begin to see something new, the first signs of a civic conscience around cleanliness. And so we end with a question. If water had become such a source of sickness and strife, what finally pushed towns toward a true transformation in how they managed it? By the early 16th century, European towns stood at a crossroads not just politically or culturally, but hydrologically. The deepening problems with urban water sources had become impossible to ignore. Disease outbreaks were commonplace. Legal disputes over wells and springs were clogging city courts, and waterborne illness quietly sapped the strength of growing populations. And yet, this period also marked the beginning of a slow, unsteady, but eventually transformative shift. From acceptance of dirty water as inevitable, to an understanding, however primitive, that the water people drank could and should be clean. This final section traces the pivotal century and a half during which ideas changed, institutions adapted, and water, long a passive element in daily life, began to be seen as a public right, a civic responsibility, and for the first time, a system that could be managed. A new conscience, from filth to reform. One of the most significant changes in the 16th and 17th centuries wasn't in technology, it was in mindset. Water had long been treated as a natural feature. Springs gushed, wells were dug, and people adapted. But in this era, urban authorities began to treat water as a managed resource. Civic pride became increasingly tied to infrastructure. Mayors and town councils competed not only to build walls or cathedrals, but to provide fountains, conduits, and access to safe water. Municipal records from this period show rising concern about the health of the people, a phrase that would become foundational in modern public health. These changes didn't happen overnight, but they were propelled by several overlapping factors: the aftermath of the plague, the spread of printing and education, the centralization of government, and most crucially, the increasing visibility of waterborne suffering. The role of the printing press and scientific curiosity. The 16th century saw the rise of a new kind of figure, the public thinker. With the printing press in full swing, information spread more rapidly than ever. Medical treatises, travel journals, and civic planning texts circulated among the educated classes. Writers like Sir Thomas More, in his Utopia, 1516, imagined ideal societies with clean water and orderly towns. Others, like Andreas Vesalius or Ambroise Paré, while focused on anatomy and surgery, still acknowledged the role of environment and cleanliness in health. This budding scientific curiosity extended to water. Early chemists experimented with purifying techniques. Physicians wrote about the effects of drinking stagnant or foul-smelling water. Though germ theory was still centuries away, the idea that something invisible might exist in water, something that caused illness, began to enter public imagination. Engineering for the public good. In some cities, this new awareness turned into action. London, once a city infamous for its fetid wells and open ditches, began to transform. The rebuilding efforts after the Great Fire of 1666 provided an opportunity. Sir Christopher Wren and other planners envisioned a cleaner, more structured city. In 1613, even before the fire, the New River Company had been established to bring fresh spring water from Hertfordshire into the city via a 38-mile artificial channel. Though privately owned, it marked one of the first major public water supply efforts in modern Europe. Paris took similar steps. After centuries of relying on polluted Seine water and aging Roman aqueduct remnants, the city invested in a new aqueduct system in the early 1600s. Later in the century, Paris constructed fountains with piped water access in central locations, giving thousands of residents their first reliable access to flowing, fresh water. Milan, Seville, and Munich also embarked on ambitious waterworks. In some cases, wealthy patrons funded fountains or cisterns as acts of public charity or religious devotion. These projects weren't just technical. They required administrative coordination, tax collection, and long-term maintenance. In short, they marked a shift in governance. Managing water became a municipal duty. Water carriers and urban professions. Even with better infrastructure, most people still didn't have running water in their homes. Instead, they relied on water carriers, men, and sometimes women, who filled barrels or buckets from fountains or cisterns and hauled them through the streets. These water carriers formed their own informal guilds. They set prices, protected their turf, and sometimes worked under contract from the city. Their presence, ubiquitous and often underappreciated, was critical. Without them, even the finest aqueduct was of little use. Interestingly, their work offered an early form of public accountability. If a water carrier brought murky or smelly water, customers complained. Some cities regulated the trade, requiring carriers to fill only from approved sources. In this way, the carriers became a bridge between infrastructure and the people. Public baths and washing places reconsidered. While water provision improved, bathing culture remained cautious. Public bathhouses, as covered in Story 1, had largely disappeared in many areas due to fears of disease and immorality. But by the 1600s, new forms of public washing began to emerge, less social, more utilitarian. In cities like Amsterdam and Copenhagen, wash houses were built along canals or rivers, allowing people, mostly women, to clean clothes in a protected environment. These were often municipal structures, roofed and equipped with benches or slabs. These spaces reflected changing attitudes. Cleanliness was no longer just a personal virtue, it was a civic expectation. Foul-smelling neighbors could be fined. Water-polluting businesses faced stricter regulations, and households were increasingly encouraged to maintain some basic standard of hygiene. The decline of polluting trades within city walls. Another critical shift was the relocation of water-polluting trades. For centuries, tanners, butchers, and dyers had operated within city limits, often right alongside residential areas. These industries required massive amounts of water and produced even greater quantities of waste. Blood, fats, dyes, and chemicals flowed directly into streets or streams. By the late 1500s, many cities began expelling these trades to the outskirts. Tannery districts moved downstream. Slaughterhouses were built on the edge of town. This was not driven solely by hygiene. Noise, smell, and property values played a role, but the result was a cleaner water table in many urban cores. In some cases, this zoning was the first step toward environmental regulation. City authorities began mapping water flows, calculating the impact of runoff, and building containment ponds. It was rudimentary, it was imperfect, but it was new. Brewing, boiling, and domestic innovation. In the home, people continued to treat water cautiously. Boiling remained a common method for preparing drinking water. Brewing continued to flourish, not just for pleasure but for health. In some cities, the quality of beer was directly linked to the quality of local water, further encouraging protection of certain springs or streams. And in wealthier homes, filtration became fashionable. Water was passed through sand, gravel, or cloth. Charcoal was sometimes added. While these methods had limited effect on microbial content, they often removed debris and improved taste. Water jugs with narrow necks helped prevent airborne contamination. Ceramic and pewter containers were used to store water in cool places, slowing the growth of algae or mold. The home was becoming slowly a place of water management rather than mere consumption. The foundation for the future. By 1700, the average European city still had foul-smelling alleys, overflowing gutters, and contaminated wells. But something had changed. Water was no longer invisible. It had entered the realm of policy, science, engineering, and ethics. The idea that the public deserved safe, clean water, though far from universally implemented, had taken root. And this change would matter deeply in the centuries to come. Because when cholera swept through cities in the 1800s, it wasn't just the disease that changed history, it was the memory of water's dangers, already planted centuries earlier, that pushed reformers to act. We end here with a final question. If water management began as a matter of survival, how did it evolve into a foundation for modern civilization? And what lessons from medieval struggles still echo in our own cities today? Story 3. The Plague Doctor's Mask, symbol of science or superstition. There's a figure you've likely seen, whether carved in a Halloween mask, painted into a macabre 17th century print, or immortalized in pop culture's darker corners. A tall, cloaked figure wearing a wide-brimmed hat, gloves, and a strange bird-like mask with glass eyes and a long, curved beak. You know it as the Plague Doctor. But what you might not know is this: that beaked figure, now a cultural icon of death and disease, was not a medieval invention. The mask itself didn't appear until centuries after the Black Death first swept across Europe. And yet, the figure of the Plague Doctor has become deeply tied to our understanding of medieval medicine, fear, and superstition. So where did the real Plague Doctors come from? What exactly did they do? And how did a long, leather beak come to symbolize both their protection and their helplessness? To answer that, we begin in the chaos of the 14th century. The Black Death arrives, 1347, 1351. When the Black Death appeared in Europe in 1347, it did so with a speed and scale that left little room for rationality. Sweeping across the continent in less than 5 years, it killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. Cities fell silent, whole villages disappeared, priests refused last rites, and families abandoned their sick. What caused the disease? No one knew. The term plague itself simply meant strike or blow, a punishment from God, a miasma in the air, or an imbalance of humors. There were no beaked masks, not yet. In the 14th century, most physicians dressed like ordinary scholars, long robes, academic hoods, maybe a sash. If they visited plague victims, they might carry a posy of herbs or a cloth soaked in vinegar, but protection was minimal. Most, wisely, stayed away. In fact, the first generation of plague doctors were not a uniform profession at all. They were often desperate volunteers, monks, or lower-ranked surgeons, men with basic anatomical knowledge but few resources. Some were skilled, others were frauds. A few were just the last ones willing to enter a sick room. Their job was grim. They inspected bodies, recorded deaths, advised on quarantines, and occasionally performed bloodletting or lanced buboes. But in truth, their treatments were often powerless. The plague was swift, unpredictable, and largely fatal. Medicine before microbes. To understand the plague doctor's role, we need to understand the medical framework of the 14th century. There were no bacteria, no viruses, no knowledge of fleas or rats. Instead, European medicine still followed the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, filtered through Arabic scholars like Avicenna and Rhazes. The human body was believed to be governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health meant balance. Disease meant imbalance. Plague, according to these theories, might be caused by corrupted air, miasma; planetary misalignment; bad diet or emotions; divine punishment. To combat it, doctors recommended bleeding, purging, herbal fumigation, or aromatic defense. People burned sulfur or pine resin in homes. Streets were cleaned or merely swept. Rich families fled to the countryside. Cities like Venice imposed early quarantines, isolating ships for 40 days, a number based more on biblical tradition than science. It was a medical system built on tradition, observation, and trial and error, but it lacked the crucial tools needed to fight a bacterial infection. And still, people needed anyone to try. Enter the contracted plague doctor. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the role of the plague doctor began to formalize. Town councils, especially in Italy and southern France, began hiring specific physicians to deal with outbreaks. These plague doctors were not private physicians. They were civic servants, contracted to care for everyone, rich or poor. Many were young or lower-ranking physicians looking to gain experience. Others were foreigners willing to risk travel for pay. Their contracts often specified a fixed salary, often with hazard pay; obligation to treat all social classes; documentation of plague deaths; limited periods of service, e.g., 6-12 months; housing and food included. In some cases, plague doctors were forbidden to leave town even during major outbreaks. These were dangerous jobs, and mortality among plague doctors was high. Still, many towns saw them as necessary. They represented an attempt, however flawed, to manage public health in an age of uncertainty. The tools of the trade before the beak. What did an early plague doctor carry? They didn't have syringes or antibiotics, but they did bring tools. Long wooden canes, used to lift clothing, point at buboes, or create distance. Pouches of herbs to hold to their nose, lavender, rosemary, camphor. Bubo lancers, small knives to drain infected swellings. Books or notes to document symptoms and deaths. Protective garments, though these were often simple cloth robes or wax coats. Their knowledge of contagion was imprecise, but not absent. Many understood that proximity led to infection. They wore gloves, avoided touch, and recommended fumigation of homes. Some advocated for clean air and exercise. But there was no consensus. One doctor might recommend bleeding and boiled onions. Another might insist on prayer and quarantine. And none of it worked, at least, not reliably. Perception of the plague doctor. In the popular imagination, plague doctors were a mixed symbol. To some, they were heroes, courageous figures willing to enter rooms others had abandoned. To others, they were ominous figures of death and futility. Many people associated their arrival with doom. If the plague doctor was in town, the disease was already there. In art and literature, they were sometimes mocked or feared, but rarely trusted. Folk songs, poems, and marginalia depicted them with exaggerated features, often in grim or absurd scenes. They were both real and symbolic, the living embodiment of a society struggling to make sense of suffering. They weren't always doctors either. In rural areas, plague men might be barbers, midwives, or even grave diggers pressed into service. Their work was more practical than scientific. They cleaned houses, burned belongings, or helped with burials. By the time the first great wave of the plague began to recede in the late 1350s, the figure of the plague doctor had begun to evolve. Though they lacked the famous mask, they had become a fixture in the social memory of plague years. But that bird-like beak, the one we so often associate with this time, that wouldn't arrive for nearly 300 years. So we're left with this lingering question. If the first plague doctors never wore the beak, where did that haunting mask come from, and what did it really mean? The great misconception that the iconic beaked mask was worn during the Black Death of the 14th century has lingered for centuries. In truth, the bird-like visage we now associate with medieval death did not exist during those earliest plagues. It was a creation of the 17th century, a product of later plague outbreaks, new theories of disease, and an increasingly visual, theatrical age. But by the time it appeared, it would quickly become the defining symbol of pestilence and fear. Let's explore how the plague doctor's mask came to be, where it originated, what purpose it served, and what it reveals about a world teetering between science, superstition, and spectacle. Plague persists, the 17th century and recurrent outbreaks. Though the Black Death's initial explosion had passed by the late 14th century, the plague never truly disappeared. Instead, it returned in waves, sometimes decades apart, often devastating anew. In Milan, 1629-1631, plague killed nearly 25% of the city's population. London's Great Plague, 1665-1666, took more than 100,000 lives. Marseille, 1720, experienced the last major European outbreak, with some 50,000 deaths. Each outbreak reignited fear, and responses varied from city to city. Some relied on strict quarantines, others on religious processions or burnings of belongings. But as the plague returned, so did the need for a specific kind of medical figure, the appointed plague doctor. And this time, they arrived dressed for the part. The beaked mask, invention, purpose, and Paris. The first documented description of the plague doctor's beaked costume comes from 1619, in Paris. It was created by Charles de Lorme, chief physician to several French royals including King Louis XIII. De Lorme's design was deliberate and for its time surprisingly rational. It included a waxed leather overcoat, covering the body from neck to ankle, boots, gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat also of leather or oilcloth, a full-face mask with round glass eye openings, a long beak-shaped nose, typically 6–12 inches in length, stuffed with aromatic herbs. The herbs were not just for show. De Lorme and many of his contemporaries believed in miasma theory, the idea that disease spread through corrupted air. Bad smells equaled bad health. The beak served as a kind of air filter, filled with ingredients thought to protect the wearer. Dried flowers like roses or lavender. Strong herbs such as mint, thyme, or cloves. Camphor, vinegar, sponges, and occasionally myrrh or opium. The idea was that these substances would neutralize the harmful vapors before they entered the doctor's nose. The glass eye lenses were meant to protect against poisonous gazes or airborne particles. The full-body coating minimized skin contact. In short, this was early hazmat gear based on flawed theory, but applied with consistent logic. The mask becomes a symbol. From the moment the costume was introduced, it made an impact. The beaked mask was terrifying both in appearance and implication. Its presence in a neighborhood signaled that plague had returned. People began to fear the figure itself as much as the disease. Contemporary accounts describe children weeping at the sight of the plague doctor. Artists began to depict them in satirical prints, woodcuts, and carnival imagery. In Italy, particularly Venice, the mask became part of the commedia dell'arte tradition. Characters like Il Medico della Peste, the plague doctor, appeared in carnivals not to heal, but to mock. He was a foolish quack, full of false remedies and exaggerated gestures. This blending of costume, medicine, and performance was unique to the era. In a society still unsure of science, and deeply embedded in ritual and symbolism, the appearance of the physician mattered as much as his knowledge. And in truth, many plague doctors were not true physicians at all. Who wore the mask? Plague doctors were often second-tier medical professionals, or in some cases, not doctors at all. Many were unlicensed medical men, barber surgeons, young graduates seeking patronage, foreigners hired for short-term service, occasionally convicted criminals serving under duress. Their job was rarely to cure. Instead, they recorded deaths and symptoms, performed autopsies, lanced buboes, issued death certificates, advised quarantines or burnings, ensured infected individuals remained isolated. In some cities, they also functioned as public witnesses, men of record who documented the scale and scope of outbreaks. Their notes became data for early public health policy. Though the costume was intended for protection, it offered no actual defense against Yersinia pestis, the bacterium causing plague. Without antibiotics or knowledge of fleas and rats, the beak was a placebo, a well-designed, but ultimately futile gesture. Cultural responses: trust, ridicule, and horror. Societies responded to the beaked doctors with a mix of reverence and mockery. In France and Germany, broadsheets and engravings depicted plague doctors as both wise men and figures of fear. Some images were clearly satirical, showing them with oversized syringes, dancing skeletons, or comically large noses. In literature, they became metaphors for false authority. Satirists pointed out that plague doctors rarely healed and often profited from death. In religious circles, they were controversial. Some clergy saw them as symbols of divine punishment, harbingers rather than helpers. Others embraced their role, working alongside them in hospitals or plague houses. In towns where plague doctors were foreigners or state-appointed outsiders, they were viewed with deep suspicion. Rumors swirled that they hastened death, that they marked doors for the undertakers, that they were immune through sorcery. The reality was often sadder. Many plague doctors died. The masks and robes didn't help. In fact, some may have increased risk by encouraging prolonged exposure to infected environments under a false sense of protection. Seeds of progress. Despite the failures, the 17th century plague doctor represents an important step in the evolution of medical professionalism. They standardized appearance. This was one of the first attempts to provide a uniform for physicians, a visual sign of duty and function. They collected data. Death records, symptom notes, and autopsy findings contributed to early epidemiological efforts. They served all classes. Unlike private doctors, plague doctors were often civic hires serving rich and poor alike. Their work, however flawed, laid part of the foundation for public health bureaucracy. And as the Enlightenment approached, with microscopes, rationalism, and scientific medicine rising from centuries of confusion, the beaked mask began to fade less a practical tool, more a haunting memory. Which leaves us with a question still lingering in the mists of time. When medicine turned away from masks and superstition, what did we lose, and what did we finally begin to understand about disease and ourselves? By the start of the 18th century, the image of the plague doctor, once a literal figure walking city streets, was beginning to disappear. The long coat, the wide-brimmed hat, and especially the bird-like beak were fading from medicine and retreating into the realm of legend, theater, and art. It wasn't just fashion that made the beaked mask obsolete. Something more profound was happening. A slow but powerful transformation was taking place in Europe, an intellectual and scientific awakening that was beginning to challenge centuries of inherited belief. As cities modernized, as medicine evolved, and as society grew increasingly skeptical of superstition, the figure of the plague doctor became a relic of a fading worldview, still vivid, still terrifying, but no longer trusted. This is the story of how the beaked mask vanished and how its absence marked the birth of something new, the scientific physician. The waning of the plague. To understand the disappearance of the plague doctor, one must begin with the disappearance of the plague itself. The last major outbreaks of bubonic plague in Western Europe occurred in Marseille, 1720–1722, one of the deadliest French outbreaks of the 18th century. Messina, 1743, in Sicily, killing tens of thousands. Smaller, scattered episodes in the Balkans and parts of Eastern Europe. After that, something curious happened. The plague stopped coming. It didn't vanish overnight, and it never fully disappeared from some parts of the world. But Western and Central Europe, which had suffered from waves of plague for nearly 400 years, saw a rapid and nearly complete cessation. Why? Historians still debate this. Some theories include better quarantine and isolation methods enforced by central governments, changes in architecture and urban design, reducing rat populations, evolutionary changes in the disease itself or its host, improvements in personal hygiene and sanitation. Whatever the cause, by the mid-18th century, the urgency that had created the plague doctor role was fading. With fewer outbreaks, cities no longer needed to hire specialists in epidemic medicine. The plague doctor's mask, once an official uniform, became unnecessary and even embarrassing, a symbol of old thinking, an echo of fear. Medicine moves forward, from symbol to science. As the Enlightenment unfolded across Europe, so too did a revolution in medical thought. New tools like the microscope allowed scientists to glimpse a hidden world, one filled not with bad air, but with tiny living things. Though germ theory wouldn't be fully developed until the 19th century, the groundwork was being laid in the 1700s. Thinkers like Antony van Leeuwenhoek, who observed bacteria in water droplets, Giovanni Battista Morgagni, who connected disease to organ pathology, William Harvey, who explained blood circulation in precise anatomical terms, were reshaping what it meant to be a physician. These men wore not masks and herbs, but laboratory coats and carried books of anatomy and chemistry. Their ideas challenged humoral theory. They pushed medicine away from symbolic gestures and toward measurable observation. Disease was no longer punishment or imbalance, it was a physical phenomenon to be studied, explained, and eventually treated. In this environment, the beaked mask became embarrassing. It belonged to an older, theatrical medicine associated with false cures, street performances, and ineffective rituals. It was not science, it was spectacle. The costume lives on, in memory and masquerade. Though the plague doctor disappeared from actual medicine, it remained alive in other ways. In Venetian Carnival, the mask took on a second life. Now called Il Medico della Peste, the character was no longer feared but laughed at, a comical figure, a satire of failed medicine. His long nose became a source of parody. In art and print, the plague doctor appeared in etchings and broadsheets, especially in Germany and the Netherlands. Artists like Paul Fouas depicted the figure as both monstrous and foolish, a symbol of confusion and helplessness during past outbreaks. In folk memory, the mask lingered. Oral stories, fairy tales, and local legends often describe the beaked doctor arriving at night, knocking on doors, carrying death in his wake. Even as rational medicine advanced, the plague doctor became a ghost in the collective imagination, a figure summoned in times of fear. From superstition to public health, the plague doctor in his strange costume represents something crucial about the history of medicine. He was a bridge, a transitional figure standing between ancient humoral medicine and early public health systems, faith-based healing and empirical observation, the symbolic and the practical. Though the methods were ineffective, the intention behind them was not. The costume, in its own way, was a precursor to modern protective equipment, an attempt to separate the caregiver from contagion. The beak filled with herbs was an early filter. The long robe was a barrier. The gloves and boots, precursors to sterile gear. We now recognize these as ineffective, but in the 17th century, they were acts of reason in an unreasonable time. They show that even when people misunderstood why disease spread, they still tried to protect themselves and others. And over time, those efforts, however flawed, evolved into the modern systems of sanitation, quarantine, and epidemiology we depend on today. Echoes in modern times. In recent years, the plague doctor has returned on book covers, in movies, in pandemic memes, and even in real-world protests. During the COVID-19 pandemic, images of plague doctors once again spread across social media. Some wore them to protest government responses. Others posted them as black humor. Still others created art comparing medieval and modern outbreaks. Why? Because the plague doctor is still us. A symbol not just of disease, but of the human response to fear. Of our desire to protect ourselves, even when knowledge fails. Of how we turn to costumes, rituals, and systems when the invisible threatens the visible. So we end with a final reflection. Was the plague doctor a failure of medicine, or its first stumbling step toward understanding, control, and compassion in the face of the unknown? Story 4. Laundry Days and Lye Soap, a peasant's chore. In the modern world, laundry is a background task. A button press, a quiet cycle, perhaps a sigh at folding shirts. But in the medieval world, especially for peasants and working households, laundry was an event. Long, exhausting, repetitive, and often deeply social, washing clothes in the Middle Ages was far more than a simple domestic task. It was a test of endurance, a rhythm of life, and in its own quiet way, a matter of survival. If you lived in a small village in the 11th century, you didn't wash your clothes every few days. Laundry day was a serious operation, often reserved for major feast days, changing seasons, or outbreaks of illness. It involved hauling water, making or buying soap, scouring cloth on rough boards, boiling heavy fabrics, and perhaps the hardest part, getting them dry in a world without dryers or even clotheslines in the modern sense. This is the story of what it took to wear something clean in the medieval world, and why even the simplest shift of linen was anything but simple. A world without washing machines. Imagine Imagine the typical household in 12th century Europe, a timber-framed cottage shared by a family of 6 or more, animals included. The hearth is central and the floor is dirt or rough planks. Furniture is sparse, possessions few. Clothing, though necessary, is expensive and limited. Most peasants owned only a few garments, an undertunic or shift, a heavier outer tunic or kirtle, and perhaps a cloak or hood. Linen was worn closest to the skin, while wool formed the outer layers. It was the linen that got dirty fastest, absorbing sweat, oils, and skin debris. That meant it had to be cleaned more often. But more often might still mean once a month or less, depending on the household's capacity. Why so infrequent? Because the process was labor-intensive. Clothes couldn't simply be dropped into a tub and forgotten. Washing meant committing an entire day, sometimes more. Tools of the laundry trade. The medieval laundry setup was simple, but effective in its own exhausting way. Wooden tubs or barrels were used for soaking and rinsing. Paddle beaters, wooden bats or sticks, helped agitate and beat dirt from fabric. Washboard-like stones were used to rub cloth clean, though true washboards didn't appear until much later. Soap, if used at all, was made from lye, an alkaline solution derived from wood ash and animal fat. This made a kind of primitive soap known as soft soap. It was caustic, sticky, and had a strong odor. Lye soap worked well on grease and dirt but could be harsh on skin and fabric. For delicate items, or when soap was unavailable, people relied on ash water, urine-based solutions, or herbal rinses with plants like soapwort. Soapwort, Saponaria officinalis, with its natural saponins, created a mild lather and was often grown in monastic or herbal gardens for precisely this purpose. The actual washing took place at home, using heated water from the hearth. At the riverside, especially for rinsing and beating. In communal washing areas, in larger towns or near manor estates. Wherever it was done, it was a day marked by wet skirts, red hands, sore backs, and soaked arms. The process, step by step. Soaking, clothes were soaked in hot or cold water, sometimes overnight to loosen dirt. Soaping and scrubbing. Soap or ash water was rubbed into fabric. Heavier items were trampled underfoot or beaten with paddles. Boiling, if possible. For linen undergarments, boiling was considered essential. A large cauldron or kettle was filled with water and heated over the hearth. Clothes were boiled to whiten and disinfect them. Rinsing. Multiple rinses were needed to remove soap or ash residue. This might require hauling water several times. Wringing. Without wringers or rollers, clothes had to be twisted and squeezed by hand, a difficult task, especially with woolen garments that absorbed huge amounts of water. Drying. Laundry was laid over bushes, hung on hedgerows, spread over fences, or draped across clean straw inside if the weather was bad. There were no clotheslines as we know them. String and rope were expensive. This could take an entire day, particularly for large households or those preparing for a holiday or important event. Who did the washing? In most peasant households, women carried out the laundry. Daughters, mothers, and wives worked together, often involving neighbors in a kind of mutual labor network. In towns or manors, washerwomen could be hired. These professional launderers worked in specific zones, often by rivers or streams designated for washing. They had a reputation for hard labor and coarse language. Working near water was loud, cold, and public. Many washerwomen also acted as midwives, herbalists, healers. Their intimate knowledge of cloth and cleanliness gave them unexpected authority in their communities. In monasteries, laundry was assigned to lay brothers or servants. Monks bathed and changed clothes more regularly than peasants, and they often had dedicated lavanderia or wash houses, structures with basins and running water. Whiteness and cleanliness. White linen was more than just practical, it became a symbol of cleanliness and virtue. It showed that a person could afford soap, firewood, and time to wash. In a world where most outer garments were darker, dyed, or stained, the sight of clean white cuffs, collars, or head coverings stood out. Among the wealthy, frequent laundering of linen was a quiet form of class display. Nobles might change linen daily, even if they rarely bathed. They believed that linen drew out bodily impurities, and changing it made one clean. Laundering these fine linens was often the job of laundresses attached to noble households, who boiled, bleached, and pressed the cloth with heated stones or glass balls. The poor, by contrast, might wear the same shift for weeks. Challenges and hazards. Laundry wasn't just tedious, it could be dangerous. Burns were common from boiling water. Back and shoulder injuries came from lifting heavy, soaked fabric. Weather could ruin a wash day if drying was delayed. Soap chemicals could cause cracked skin or eye injuries. Clothing theft was a risk, especially when items were left to dry in public. There were also superstitions. Some believed washing on certain days brought bad luck. Others avoided washing during church holidays. In parts of rural Europe, washing day had ritual overtones, tied to seasonal or religious calendars. So by the time your average medieval peasant donned a clean shirt, it was the result of real, hard labor, often the work of multiple people, over hours or even days. It's tempting to see the past as dirtier, less refined, but cleanliness existed in effort, not ease, and laundry, for all its drudgery, was a proud, visible symbol of diligence, womanhood, and domestic mastery. We'll close with a practical question. In a world where laundry was so difficult, how did people decide when it was finally time to wash, and what happened when they did? The peasant's life in the later Middle Ages was one of cycles of sowing and reaping, of feast and fast, of dirt and the rare relief of cleanliness. If the first part of this story laid out the how of medieval laundry, this section explores the when, the why, and the what if not of washing. Because as much as people valued clean clothing, they also had to balance it against practicality. Firewood was precious. Soap could be expensive. Time was limited. And bodies, clothes, homes, and tools all shared the same space, often the same dirt. So how did medieval people live with laundry as an occasional, seasonal act rather than a daily habit? And what did their attitudes toward clothing cleanliness tell us about the way they understood health, hygiene, and social order? Let's step back into a typical 14th century village and peer into the linen chest, not just to see what's clean, but what's still waiting. How often was laundry done? The answer depends on who you were, where you lived, and how many resources you had. For most rural peasants, linen undergarments, the inner shift or shirt, might be washed every few weeks. Wool outer garments were washed infrequently, maybe once or twice a year, due to the risk of shrinkage and the effort involved. Bedding might be washed seasonally, or simply aired out and beaten to remove dust and lice. In wealthier households, particularly among townsfolk and minor gentry, linens were washed more frequently, once a week in some cases. More garments meant more rotation. Clean shifts could be worn, while dirty ones were washed. Dedicated servants or laundresses could handle the task. Monasteries, due to their more regular schedules, had clearer records. Some Benedictine rules, for instance, allowed monks to change linen weekly. The laundry was carefully managed, as cleanliness was considered not just hygienic but spiritually appropriate, a mark of internal as well as external order. But for the vast majority, clothing was worn until visibly dirty, or until the next planned washing day arrived. Recognizing the time to wash, people did not operate with our modern expectations of invisible hygiene. They lived with dirt, smell, and visible signs of wear. So how did they know when to wash? Visible staining from sweat, food, or soil. Odor, especially from underarms and feet. Skin irritation, itchiness, or lice often prompted clothing changes. Seasonal events such as Easter, harvest's end, or local feast days. Religious periods like Lent or Advent, which sometimes included personal and domestic cleansing. Preparation for travel, childbirth, guests, or weddings. There was also an emotional element. Clean clothes were part of social performance worn at markets, festivals, or church. A clean collar, cuffs, or coif was a way to show face, even if the rest of the garments remained unwashed. The smell of normal life. We often forget that everyone smelled. There was no expectation of total freshness. People were accustomed to the sense of wood smoke, animal sweat, body odor, dried herbs, and smoke-infused garments. But there were ways to manage smell. Clothing was aired out, regularly hung on hedgerows or near the fire to dispel dampness. Herbal sachets were placed in chests or sewn into garments. Lavender, rosemary, and wormwood were popular. People used linen underlayers to absorb sweat and keep wool clean. Linen was smoother, more breathable, and easier to wash. Outer garments might be brushed down or sprinkled with vinegar solutions. In towns, perfumed gloves or handkerchiefs were used, both practical and symbolic. The point wasn't to eliminate all odor, it was to avoid being noticeably foul. The social meaning of clean clothes. Clean clothing carried moral weight. In religious sermons and folk tales, cleanliness was often associated with purity, virtue, and order. Filth, conversely, was tied to sin, sloth, or moral decay. This wasn't just metaphorical. In court records and sumptuary laws, people were judged partly by their appearance. Wearing clean, modest garments was seen as a sign of honesty and discipline. Dirty or torn clothing might invite scrutiny, especially in towns or at official events. Servants and apprentices were expected to keep clothing presentable as a mark of respectability. This applied even to public punishments. Criminals or adulterers were sometimes forced to wear soiled clothes or had them publicly burned. The link between moral and physical cleanliness was deeply entrenched. What if you didn't wash? There were consequences: social, physical, and even medical. Skin conditions were common. Rashes, boils, and infestations like lice or scabies thrived in unwashed clothing. Lice and fleas infested bedding and underclothes, often requiring more laundering than garments themselves. Itch powders blended from dried herbs or even ground insects were sometimes used to draw out pests, though their efficacy was limited. Medical texts from the period advised regular changes of linen to prevent damp humors and rotting vapors. Despite all this, people endured. In the absence of modern hygiene, they developed coping strategies rather than cures. You didn't eliminate filth, you managed it. In extreme cases, such as during plague outbreaks, clothing was burned, washed in vinegar, or steeped in urine. But for most people, the effort of full body or full clothing hygiene was simply too great to do often. Instead, they targeted the worst spots, washing only the underarms and necklines, soaking socks or sleeves, spot treating stains with ash or lye. Laundry was, in effect, triaged with priority given to what touched the skin or could be seen by others. Communal and ritual washing. In some places, washing was a community event. Women gathered at riverside wash areas or public fountains, combining labor with gossip, storytelling, or even singing. This wasn't leisure, it was grueling work, but it offered moments of camaraderie. It also reinforced social norms. Women learned laundry techniques from each other, passed down recipes for soap or stain removal, and judged neighbors by their efforts. In larger towns, certain days were designated for washing. Public access to fountains or wash stones was scheduled, and laundresses had to wait their turn or risk fines. Some religious festivals included ritual washing of garments or linens, part of a broader idea of spiritual renewal through physical cleanliness. So by the late Middle Ages, laundry had become a complex dance of labor, appearance, class, and belief. It was a burden mostly carried by women, often unnoticed but essential to the social fabric. Clean clothing wasn't just about hygiene, it was about identity. A clean shift, a fresh coif, a well-rinsed tunic, these were badges of effort, pride, and in many ways, resistance to the chaos of medieval life. And yet a question lingers. If the people of the Middle Ages had so few clothes and washed them so rarely, what happened when clothes wore out, and how did they make them last as long as possible? By now, you've seen how laundry in the Middle Ages was an act of labor, timing, and necessity, a far cry from the effortless hum of a washing machine. But another essential part of the medieval clothing cycle remains. What happened when those precious garments began to wear out? Because in a world where fabric was expensive, access to new clothing was limited, and laundry itself wore down the cloth, maintaining a wardrobe was not about consumption, it was about conservation. In this final section of Story 4, we turn our attention to the end of a garment's life, how medieval people stretched the usefulness of every thread, repurposed what could be saved, and coped with the inevitable decay of clothing in a pre-industrial world. Clothing as capital. To truly understand the value of clothing in the Middle Ages, you must think of it not as fashion, but as currency. For the lower classes, especially peasants and laborers, garments represented an investment of time and resources. A tunic, shift, or pair of hose was often handmade or passed down, repaired multiple times, recorded in wills, dowries, or inventories, sometimes used as payment in kind for labor. A household's garments might be its most expensive possessions after tools and livestock. Even among wealthier townsfolk, clothing accounted for a significant portion of household spending. This meant that nothing was wasted. A worn-out shirt wasn't thrown away, it was repurposed. A damaged cloak wasn't replaced immediately, it was patched. Mending as a household skill. Mending was as important as laundering, and often more frequent. The tools were basic. Needles made of iron or bronze. Thread spun from linen, wool, or silk, depending on class. Thimbles and scissors. Darning eggs, usually wooden or ceramic, for mending socks and mittens. Almost every household had a sewing kit. Women were expected to mend not only their own clothing, but that of husbands, children, and even neighbors in times of need. Common mending techniques included darning, weaving new threads across worn spots. Patching, sewing on small pieces of similar fabric to cover holes. Reinforcing, stitching extra cloth into high-wear areas like elbows, knees, or underarms. These repairs weren't always hidden. In fact, they could become a mark of care or thrift. For the poor, visible patches might even serve as a kind of humble badge of dignity, evidence of work, endurance, and familial responsibility. Reuse and recycling. When a garment became too damaged to wear even with mending, it didn't go to waste. Instead, it entered the reuse cycle. Cutting down. An old adult garment might be cut and resewn into children's clothing. Household rags. Cloth was used for dishcloth, cleaning rags, bandages, or even toilet cloths. Quilting or stuffing. Linen and wool remnants were used to stuff pillows, bolster mattresses, or insulate walls. Patching other clothes. Strips from worn garments were harvested to patch newer ones. Crafting and spinning. In some cases, worn linen was shredded and added to paper production, especially in monasteries or towns with early papermaking. Very little fabric was discarded outright, and if it was burned or buried, it was usually only after decades of service. The rag trade. By the later Middle Ages, the demand for second-hand and repurposed clothing had grown so significantly that it gave rise to a profession, the ragman or fripperer. Fripperers. bought and sold used garments in town markets, bought clothes from households in need of quick coin, supplied fabric to those who couldn't afford new cloth, collected worn garments for resale, reuse, or dismantling. In large cities like Paris or London, second-hand clothing stalls were common. These garments weren't necessarily dirty or discarded. They were often well-made, finely dyed, and valued by lower-status buyers. The rag trade became so influential that some towns attempted to regulate it, banning the sale of clothing taken from the dead during plague outbreaks, or forbidding deceptive dyeing of worn-out fabrics. In a society built on visible appearance, even used clothes had social meaning. A man in a well-maintained second-hand tunic could still pass as respectable. One in stained, torn, or poorly fitted garb invited suspicion or ridicule. The role of fabric and fiber. The kind of fabric affected how clothing wore out and how it was treated. Linen, used for undergarments, was strong and could withstand boiling. It softened with age but rarely tore suddenly. Wool, used for outerwear, was warm, water-resistant, and versatile. It shrank if washed improperly and could become itchy with age. Silk, for the wealthy, frayed more quickly but was prized and often lined or reinforced. Cotton was rare in Europe before the 16th century and remained expensive well into the early modern period. Poorer households favored undyed or coarsely woven wool and linen, which aged visibly but remained functional. Dyes often faded, especially vegetable-based ones. A once-dyed tunic might become blotchy after sun exposure or washing, giving clothes a mottled, time-worn look that became familiar. Washing and wearing, a balancing act. It's important to understand that washing wore out clothes. Boiling damaged linen fibers over time. Soap, especially lye-based, degraded dyes and finishes. Beating garments against stones frayed hems and seams. This meant that many households practiced targeted cleaning. Stains were spot-treated. Garments were brushed, aired, and sun-dried without full soaking. In fact, one of the signs of poverty wasn't dirt, it was clothing that had been washed so often it had faded or frayed beyond repair. Thus, people managed a delicate balance. Wash too often and your clothes wore out. Wash too little and you risked disease or public shame. Mend as much as you could, repurpose everything else. Symbolism of the old and patched. In medieval literature and sermons, patched clothing became a metaphor. The good wife was one who kept her family clothed through diligence and repair. The foolish youth let his hose tear or tunic unravel, showing vanity or laziness. In religious texts, patched clothes could symbolize humility, poverty, or spiritual richness. In some saints' legends, holy figures wore threadbare clothes by choice, demonstrating rejection of worldly vanity. Conversely, impostors or heretics were sometimes accused of wearing artificially tattered clothes, mimicking poverty for sympathy or deception. Even sumptuary laws designed to regulate who could wear what sometimes included restrictions on the reuse of noble clothing by commoners. The end of a garment's life. When a piece of clothing finally met its end, it often did so as a rag, stuffing, kindling, or even compost if plant-based. It was not discarded lightly. The memory of each garment, the hours spent sewing it, washing it, mending it, wearing it to church or feast was woven into its threads. A tunic might be worn as bridal wear, live a second life as a child's smock, and die as a scrub rag in a wood-fired kitchen. Every patch told a story. We often think of sustainability as a modern idea, but in truth, medieval people lived in a world of near-total reuse, where every fiber mattered and every hand stitch counted. So we end this story of medieval laundry not with soap, but with thread. In a world without closets or machines, it was needle, ash, water, and will that kept people clothed and kept the fabric of life from unraveling. Story 5. The Privy Problem. Where did people go? Modern life has sanitized away one of the most fundamental realities of daily existence: what to do when nature calls. With indoor plumbing, locked doors, and high-efficiency flush toilets, the modern world hides its bodily functions in porcelain and tile. But in the medieval world, that convenience didn't exist. There were no sewers in most villages, no flush toilets, no septic tanks or municipal sanitation. And yet, people still had to relieve themselves every day, just like we do now. So where did they go? That question opens a door, a rickety wooden one, probably without a lock, into the strange, smelly, and surprisingly complex world of medieval sanitation. From castle guardrobes to dung heaps, from chamber pots to communal latrines, the history of human waste in the Middle Ages is a story of engineering, improvisation, and social negotiation. It's not a glamorous topic, but it's an essential one, because understanding where people went and what they did with it after offers a rare and honest view of how medieval people really lived. Going to the bathroom in a world without bathrooms. Let's start in a modest peasant home around the year 1100. You're in a thatched cottage, one room with a packed dirt floor and perhaps a hearth in the center. You sleep, eat, and work in this space. Where do you relieve yourself? The short answer is outside. Most rural people went to the edge of their property, into the woods, behind a hedge, or to a designated privy spot behind the house. If they were lucky and had the materials, they may have dug a shallow pit. If not, they relied on a more informal arrangement, what might generously be called natural facilities. This was common practice for men and women at all hours of day and night, often with no barrier or shelter. Nighttime needs were handled with chamber pots, often just a clay or wooden bowl kept under the bed. In the morning, this waste was either emptied into a backyard pit, thrown onto the dung heap. In some towns, simply tossed into the street, sometimes with a shouted warning. For the poorest villagers, privacy was minimal, and convenience outweighed decorum. The dung heap and the household cycle. The dung heap was central to rural medieval waste management. It wasn't just for human waste, it also held animal droppings, food scraps, ashes from the hearth, soiled straw from bedding. These heaps were often located near gardens or fields. Over time, they were used to enrich the soil, especially for crops like flax or barley. It's easy to wrinkle your nose at this, but the dung heap represented a kind of closed-loop sanitation system. Waste returned to the earth, nourishing the next generation of food or linen plants. Crude, yes, but not irrational. The key was management. A well-kept heap was layered, turned occasionally, and located downhill from the home. A badly placed heap, on the other hand, could contaminate the water supply or cause illness. In many villages, customs emerged about where to put your heap, how to use it, and when to move it. This wasn't written down, but passed orally sanitation by shared knowledge. Privies in towns and larger homes. In medieval towns, where space was limited and neighbors were close, the privy became more formalized. A typical town privy might be a small wooden outhouse located behind the home, built over a cesspit, a hole lined with stone or wood, occasionally shared between multiple homes, emptied once a season or not. Cesspits were sometimes covered with wooden lids or straw. When full, they were either dug out or abandoned and replaced. In denser cities, the buildup of waste led to serious problems: smell, disease, and disputes between neighbors. Enter the gong farmer. The gong farmer, a dirty job for desperate men. The gong farmer, or night soil man, was the medieval answer to a blocked latrine. These were workers hired usually at night to empty cesspits and haul away human waste. Their work was dangerous due to collapsing pits and fumes. Reviled, they often lived apart from others. Occasionally well paid, because no one else wanted the job. In cities like London, they carted waste to dung fields outside the walls. In some towns, waste was dumped into rivers or used in agriculture. Regulations sometimes existed. The hours when waste could be transported, where it could be dumped, and how cesspits should be built. But enforcement varied, and during summer, the smell could be overwhelming. The garderobe castle toilets. If you were wealthy or lived in a monastery or castle, you might have access to a garderobe. A garderobe was a small stone room, often built into the outer wall, equipped with a stone or wooden seat, positioned over a chute or shaft that dropped the waste down to a pit or moat. Some garderobes had simple drainage systems. Others relied on the natural decay of waste or occasional flushing with rainwater. Interestingly, the word garderobe literally means wardrobe or cloakroom. Why? Because people often hung garments near the toilet shaft. The smell and ammonia content were thought to repel moths and fleas. Medieval multitasking at its finest. Monastic sanitation. Monasteries were the cleanest places in medieval Europe, relatively speaking. Many had running water systems, often channeled from springs. Lavatoriums for hand washing. Communal latrines, known as reredators, often located at the end of dormitory halls. Monastic latrines were sometimes positioned over flowing streams, allowing for a crude version of flush sanitation. Some abbeys had multi-seat arrangements, with screens for modesty. The rule of St. Benedict even mentioned toilet visits monks were to go in pairs, with humility and quietness. What about toilet paper? There was no toilet paper, of course. Instead, people used straw or hay, moss or grass, wool scraps or linen rags, smooth stones or broken pottery in some areas, left hands in water, more common in Islamic regions. In wealthier homes, cloth scraps might be used and then laundered carefully. But for most, wiping was rudimentary, quick, and not spoken of in polite company. The smell of the Middle Ages. It would be wrong to say that medieval people didn't notice or care about smell. They did, but their threshold for what was tolerable was simply much higher. Waste and its management were part of life, like baking or herding animals. People accepted a certain level of filth, but they also recognized when it went too far, when a cesspit overflowed, when a well turned foul, or when neighbors dumped waste in the street. Civic records from cities like York, Paris, and Lubeck contain complaints, fines, and ordinances aimed at managing human waste. Sanitation mattered, it just operated on different standards. So when medieval people needed to go, they did. Behind the house, in a garderobe on a hillside, or into a chamber pot. The systems they built were imperfect but functional, and often surprisingly adaptive to their environment. We end this section with a question that gets at the heart of early urban life. If waste was being produced every day in growing cities and towns, how did communities handle the buildup, and what were the health consequences when they did? In the great medieval cities London, Paris, Florence, Bruges, the streets bustled with merchants, carts, livestock, and the daily foot traffic of thousands. But beneath the surface of this vibrancy, literally and figuratively, lay a different reality, a growing tide of human waste. By the 14th and 15th centuries, as populations swelled and urban centers expanded, the old rural habits of stepping behind a hedge or emptying a pot into a quiet corner no longer sufficed. Cities needed systems, but most were not designed with waste management in mind. So what happened when there were more people, more chamber pots, more privies, and more filth than the streets could handle? This section delves into the unglamorous but critical evolution of medieval sanitation in the urban context, a story of public latrines, overflowing cesspits, city laws, night soil collectors, and the slow realization that dealing with waste was a matter not only of dignity, but of survival. Growing towns, growing waste. By the early 1300s, many European towns had experienced population booms. London had over 80,000 residents before the Black Death. Paris was approaching 200,000. Florence, Cologne, and Ghent were bustling, crowded trade hubs. All of these people ate and therefore eliminated. The result was thousands of gallons of human waste daily with no sewer systems as we would recognize them. Instead, most towns relied on a combination of private cesspits, open ditches or gutters, kennels, rivers or streams, manure heaps, middens, public privies or communal latrines in limited numbers. It's important to understand that there was no centralized waste removal system. Each household, business, or landlord was responsible for their own mess or for paying someone to deal with it. This led to a patchwork of solutions, many of which failed spectacularly. The cesspit crisis. Urban homes, even small ones, typically had privies built over cesspits, pits dug into the earth, lined with clay or stone, designed to collect excrement. When full, a cesspit could overflow into neighboring yards or basements, leaked into wells or water tables, created unbearable smells during summer, became a breeding ground for disease-carrying insects. The worst-case scenario, structural collapse. Many court records tell of unsuspecting individuals falling through rotten boards or thin floors into their own or their neighbors' cesspits. Some died. Some were simply covered in what medieval records euphemistically referred to as filth or night soil. It's no coincidence that the word privy in legal documents often appears next to words like nuisance, dispute, and fine. Gong farmers in the night soil economy. Enter the gong farmer, the unsung sanitation worker of the medieval world. By the late 1300s, many towns had begun to employ or regulate workers tasked with cleaning out cesspits and removing accumulated waste. Known by various names, gong farmers in England, fossers in France, they typically worked at night using long-handled shovels or scoops, buckets and barrels, horse-drawn carts lined with straw or cloth. These men often operated under contract from the city, were barred from living inside the city walls, had to wear distinctive clothing, were paid relatively well but socially shunned. The waste was hauled to lay stalls, designated dumping grounds outside the city, or sold to farmers as fertilizer. In some cities like Bruges and Lübeck, authorities created official schedules and routes for these waste removers, attempting to coordinate their efforts. Still, there were regular complaints about missed collections and illegal dumping. Street disposal and the sound of warning. Not all waste made it to the dung cart. In densely packed neighborhoods, people relied on chamber pots, especially at night, and unless you were wealthy or had a servant to empty them discreetly, many simply opened a window, tipped the contents into the gutter, shouted a warning, garde-à-l'eau, from the French garde à l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. This warning was particularly common in Scotland and northern England, but similar practices occurred across Europe. Streets were often built with a central gutter, called a kennel in England, designed to carry away water and whatever else was dumped into it. But during dry spells, these gutters stagnated. In winter, waste froze. In summer, it baked. The smell, as one 15th century chronicler described, an air so foul it could curdle the breath. The civic response, ordinances, fines, and foulness. By the mid-14th century, urban governments began to respond with bylaws and regulations aimed at controlling the chaos of waste. Examples: London, 1383, residents fined for throwing waste into the Thames. Paris, 1357, regulations on privy construction and gutter cleaning. Cologne, bans on dumping near public fountains. Bruges, required cesspits to be a certain distance from wells. Cities hired muck inspectors to check on compliance. They posted edicts in marketplaces. In some towns, guilds were responsible for ensuring members' homes met sanitation standards. Still, enforcement was inconsistent. Wealthy citizens could bribe inspectors. Poor households ignored the rules because they had no alternative. Public health as a concept didn't exist. Instead, these laws were driven by smell, reputation, and neighborly complaints. Public latrines and communal solutions. Some cities attempted larger-scale solutions. Public privies near markets or gates, usually fee-based. Bridge toilets, built into the sides of structures like London Bridge or the Ponte Vecchio in Florence. Riverside latrines, positioned to allow waste to fall directly into moving water. Monasteries, guild halls, and universities sometimes had multi-seat latrines for their members. These were often over pits or channels flushed with water from nearby streams. But even these communal facilities required maintenance. When neglected, they became centers of stench and disease. The Black Death and sanitary panic. The arrival of the Black Death in 1347 changed how people viewed cleanliness. Though they didn't understand contagion, many believed that smells carried sickness, a theory known as miasma. In response, streets were cleaned more often, though sometimes just swept, not cleared. Latrines were whitewashed with lime to cleanse them. Cesspits were ordered covered, filled, or relocated. Public bathhouses and privies were sometimes shut down to avoid gathering disease. Despite these efforts, the link between waste and illness remained theoretical, not medical. It would take centuries for true sewer systems and germ theory to emerge. But the plague did one thing. It convinced cities that waste mattered, that the smell of rot was more than a nuisance, it was a potential death sentence. So what was the experience of sanitation in a medieval city? It was a combination of individual ingenuity, civic effort, and public compromise. Most people lived within reach of a privy, but not always by choice. They endured stench, overflow, and regulation, often with resignation. And despite all efforts, urban sanitation remained a struggle fought one bucket, one cesspit, one shouted warning at a time. Which leaves us with a question for the ages. If medieval cities struggled for centuries to manage their waste, what finally led to true sanitation reform, and how much filth did it take to make change inevitable? By the 16th century, European cities were bursting at the seams. Populations were climbing again after the devastations of the plague. Streets were livelier and smellier than ever. The medieval struggle to manage waste had not disappeared. If anything, it had intensified. As early modern life took shape with printing presses, Renaissance learning, and the first stirrings of scientific thought, the old problems of where people went and what to do with what they left behind remained unsolved. But something new was emerging, an idea that human waste wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous, and cities had a responsibility to control it. This final section explores the evolution of sanitation from the late medieval period into the early modern age. It's a story not of sudden innovation, but of slow, grudging change driven by foul smells, public protests, accidental discoveries, and the beginnings of a very modern idea: public health. The problem persists. Despite attempts at regulation, the same issues continued into the 16th and 17th centuries. Cesspits overflowed in densely packed neighborhoods. Chamber pots were still dumped into streets or alleys. Waste ran down gutters into local rivers, polluting the very sources of drinking water. In wealthier households, multiple privies often drained into shared pits, which could collapse or leach into cellars. Some efforts at improvement were made. Wealthy homes hired servants to empty chamber pots discreetly. Cities licensed gong farmers, giving them limited privileges and more defined routes. Some communities began building covered sewers, essentially stone-lined trenches with lids. But large-scale transformation was still centuries away. Even in London, arguably the most advanced city in Northern Europe, most homes lacked any kind of flushing system until the late 1600s. Engineering improvements, slow and localized. In some cities, progress emerged through small-scale engineering projects. Paris maintained a system of covered stone sewers in some central districts by the 1600s, but most were open or broken. Nuremberg, Amsterdam, and Venice had more advanced drainage, owing to their flat terrain and water management needs. London, in response to public outrage, began slowly paving and draining key roads and constructing waste ditches. Yet even these improvements were limited to select areas, wealthier neighborhoods, market squares, or palace grounds. The average person still dealt with shared latrines, uncovered cesspits, water supply drawn near waste sites. And since many streets lacked consistent paving, even basic runoff could leave pools of filth where children played and animals drank. Early signs of sanitation reform. In the 17th century, a few thinkers began to look at waste not just as a nuisance, but as a health hazard. The concept of miasma, bad air caused by rotting matter, grew stronger. Physicians and natural philosophers speculated that decaying waste might cause plagues or putrid fevers. Examples of this new thinking include Sir John Harington's invention of a flush toilet in 1596, installed at Richmond Palace for Queen Elizabeth I. Though impressive, it didn't catch on widely. City ordinances requiring the relocation of tanneries, latrines, and slaughterhouses away from wells and fountains. Increasing awareness that waste near water sources was especially dangerous, particularly during outbreaks. These ideas remained speculative, but they hinted at a shifting mental model of cleanliness, one that saw human waste as a civic problem, not just a private one. The role of class in cleanliness. By the 1600s, social class increasingly shaped access to sanitation. The wealthy began installing primitive flushing privies called water closets that drained into cesspits or sewers. These were rare, costly, and often inefficient. Courts and castles built improved guardrobes, lined with glazed tiles or polished wood, and hired staff to manage the waste. Urban professionals, such as merchants and lawyers, began hiring regular night soil men to maintain cleanliness. Meanwhile, the poor relied on shared facilities, open latrines, or nearby gutters. In slums or tenements, waste often accumulated for days. Complaints were common, but solutions were few. This created a new kind of division, not just between clean and dirty, but between those who could avoid filth and those who had to live in it. Public shame and private relief. One of the clearest signs of evolving attitudes was the increasing shame associated with exposure to human waste. In earlier centuries, bodily functions had been more public, relieved behind a hedge, on a roadside, or in communal privies. But by the 1600s, indoor chamber pots were more common and emptied discreetly. Households hung curtains or screens near privies. Public latrines were sometimes divided by gender or screened for privacy. Civic leaders began to fine those who dumped waste openly, even in poor neighborhoods. Print culture added to this pressure. Pamphlets, woodcuts, and plays mocked those who failed to manage waste, portraying them as uncivilized or vulgar. The message was clear. Cleanliness was no longer just comfort, it was character. Cities at a breaking point. By the end of the 17th century, cities across Europe were nearing a breaking point. Population growth, urban density, and increased trade brought more people and more waste than ever before. Rivers like the Thames, the Seine, and the Arno were visibly polluted. Waterborne diseases like dysentery and typhoid were common. And the Great Plague of London, 1665, reignited fears of filth. Though people didn't understand microbes, they linked disease and decay more clearly than ever before. Some cities took dramatic action. Rome cleared its Cloaca Maxima, ancient sewer. Amsterdam expanded its canal dredging efforts. London, after the Great Fire, 1666, redesigned many streets and markets, setting the stage for later sewer development. But the true sanitation revolution flushed toilets, underground sewers, running water was still a century away. The lasting lessons. What did medieval and early modern sanitation efforts leave behind? More than just the smell. They left a culture of private hygiene, slowly evolving from shame and necessity. A recognition that waste was a civic issue, not just an individual inconvenience. The first crude examples of public health policy, enforced imperfectly through law, labor, and local cooperation. And perhaps most importantly, they left behind stories of gong farmers and guardrobes, of chamber pots and city fines, of how human beings, lacking modern knowledge, still found ways to manage the most basic facts of life. So we end with one final reflection. Before sewers, before plumbing, before flush toilets, people still found ways to live, clean, and endure. What will future generations think of our systems? And what, someday, might they consider primitive in our own search for sanitation? Story 6. Monks and the Rule of Cleanliness. Silent scrubbing in the cloister. Behind thick stone walls and under the shadow of steeples, medieval monasteries were worlds unto themselves, silent, orderly, and deeply structured. Within those cloistered spaces, monks lived lives bound by devotion, discipline, and an often overlooked part of daily life: cleanliness. In contrast to the disorder and grime of the outside world, many monastic communities placed a surprising emphasis on hygiene. While most of medieval Europe struggled to manage waste, laundry, and basic washing, monasteries often had dedicated systems for water supply, bathing, latrines, and laundry, developed not from luxury but from spiritual discipline. This is the story of how monks washed their hands, their robes, their feet, their souls within a framework where cleanliness was less about comfort and more about obedience and purity. The Rule of St. Benedict, a blueprint for monastic living. To understand monastic hygiene, we begin with a book not of medicine, but of rules. The Rule of St. Benedict, written around 530 CE, became the foundation for Western monastic life throughout the Middle Ages. Adopted across much of Europe, the rule set the tone for everything from prayer to meals to sleep. And importantly, it addressed cleanliness. In chapter 36, for example, Benedict wrote that the sick should have baths when necessary. In chapter 55, he advised that monks change their undergarments weekly, or more often if needed. Washing was not constant, but it was expected. Monks were to be modest, clean, and orderly externally as a reflection of their internal devotion. Sloppiness in dress or bodily care was frowned upon. Clean habits were a spiritual matter. The lavatorium, ritual and routine. A key feature in most large monasteries was the lavatorium, a washing place, typically located near the refectory, dining hall, often under an open arcade in the cloister walk. The lavatorium featured a long stone trough or basin, running water channeled from nearby springs or streams, brass or stone taps in later periods, towels hung nearby, typically on hooks or wooden rods. Before meals, monks were required to wash their hands in silence. This act was ritualized, with some monasteries assigning a reader to read aloud from scripture while others washed. In some communities, weekly foot washing also occurred, often in imitation of Christ washing the disciples' feet. This ceremony was especially emphasized during Holy Week. The lavatorium was not for bathing, but for ritual purification, reinforcing the link between bodily order and spiritual readiness. The Rered Order, monastic latrines. Perhaps the most advanced sanitary structures of the medieval world were monastic latrines, or rered orders, from Anglo-Latin reridatorium, attached to dormitories. These structures were often multi-seated with 8, 16 or more seats, were placed over flowing water channels, carrying waste away, included ventilation shafts and screens for privacy, were maintained according to strict rules of cleanliness. In larger monasteries like Cluny in France or Revolx in England, latrines were carefully designed with gravity-fed drainage and sometimes included rainwater flushing systems. Monks were expected to use the Rered Order at scheduled times, often before matins or after compline. Talking was forbidden. Cleanliness was enforced not only by rules, but by peer pressure and daily routine. For a society without modern plumbing, these structures were astonishingly sophisticated. Monastic bathing, frequency and function. Bathing was not daily, but it was regular, more so than in most lay communities. Monks typically bathed every few weeks, depending on weather and resources, before feast days or important liturgical events, when sick, elderly, or required by labor. Some Benedictine monasteries provided bathing rooms, balnearia, heated by furnaces or located near the kitchen to share warm water. These weren't lavish baths, but small stone rooms with wooden tubs. Bathing was often done in pairs to prevent sinful behavior, and always in silence. Towels and clean linen were provided. Soap made of ash and fat was used sparingly. Unlike the public bathhouses of cities, monastic bathing was controlled, private, and moralized. Laundry and the monastic wardrobe. Monks wore simple garments, a habit, scapular, cowl, and tunic usually made of undyed wool. Underneath, they wore a linen shirt or camisia, which absorbed sweat and oils and was washed weekly. Laundry was a communal chore, undertaken in a designated area, often outdoors or in a wash house. Using lye soap, hot water, and wooden paddles. Dried on hedges or lines within the cloister walls. Folded and stored in armaria, linen cupboards, or returned to individual monks. Monasteries had assigned roles, including the cellarer, who oversaw supplies, the infirmarian, who managed clothing for the sick, the laundress, often a woman working outside the cloister, who handled washing for female convents or hired help. Clean garments were a visible sign of internal discipline. Tears and stains were mended quickly. Disobedience or sloppiness in dress could result in reprimands or penance. Cleanliness, contemplation, and control. Cleanliness in the monastery was not about vanity. It was about control. Control over the body, over appetite, over desire. To keep one's clothing clean was to practice stewardship of time, materials, and self. To wash hands before meals was to prepare for receiving God's gift. To bathe on occasion was to prevent illness and distraction. The connection between physical and spiritual purity ran deep. In medieval theological thought, sin was often associated with filth, decay, and disorder. Monks aimed to reflect divine order in their daily routines, scrubbed, shaved, silent, and scheduled. So, while much of medieval society accepted a rough and ready relationship with dirt, the monastery offered a counterpoint, a microcosm of cleanliness where water ran through stone channels, soap was prepared with care, and silence accompanied scrubbing. It wasn't luxury, it was discipline. But we end with a question. If monastic hygiene was rooted in spiritual order, what happened when that order broke down, or when the outside world's filth found its way into the cloister? The medieval monastery was, in many ways, a marvel of organized life, especially compared to the chaotic villages and cities of the era. But no amount of ritual, rule, or routine could fully shield monastic life from the outside world. And during the later Middle Ages, that world began to intrude. Between 1200 and 1450, monasteries across Europe encountered new pressures: rising populations, economic hardship, war, and above all, disease. Even in cloisters, where order was sacred and cleanliness a form of spiritual discipline, filth crept in. This was the period of tension between aspiration and reality, when the ideal of monastic hygiene was challenged by the very forces it sought to keep out. In this section, we explore what happened when the baths went cold, the red orders overflowed, and the silence of the cloister was broken by coughs, contagion, and compromise. The outside world closes in. By the early 13th century, monasteries had grown in size and influence. Some, like the Benedictine Abbey of Cluny or the Cistercian houses in France and England, commanded vast lands and hosted hundreds of monks, lay brothers, and servants. With scale came complexity. More people meant more waste, more laundry, more strain on water systems. Guests and pilgrims increased traffic, especially in monastic hospitals and hostels. Expanding libraries, breweries, and infirmaries meant greater movement of materials and the dirt they brought. The neat, idealized rhythm of washing before meals or bathing on holy days was harder to maintain. Monks might skip routines when the lavatorium ran dry. Cesspits filled faster than they could be cleared. In some houses, discipline weakened, and with it, the commitment to bodily cleanliness. The Black Death, an uninvited guest. No disruption was more severe than the arrival of the Black Death in the mid-14th century. Starting in 1347, plague spread rapidly through port cities and into the countryside, striking monasteries with terrible force. Ironically, the very factors that made cloisters orderly communal meals, shared dormitories, tightly packed prayer schedules made them ideal environments for contagion. Historical records show some monasteries lost half or more of their brethren within weeks. Entire communities were wiped out or abandoned. Surviving monks were often too few or too ill to maintain daily routines, let alone sanitation. Suddenly, the rituals of cleanliness gave way to triage and survival. Lavatoria fell into disrepair, red orders overflowed. Burial grounds, once meticulously maintained, filled faster than monks could dig. The sacred order of monastic life dissolved under the weight of death. And with fewer monks, there were fewer hands to clean, wash, mend, and manage. The surviving communities became, by necessity, more lenient. Changing attitudes, declining standards. Even outside of plague years, the later Middle Ages saw growing criticism of monastic cleanliness not by outsiders, but by reformers within the church. Concerns included monks growing lax in their observance of hygiene rules, abuses of bath privileges, monks taking extra baths, or using warm water considered a luxury, lavatoria left cracked, moldy, or idle, laundry tasks being outsourced to lay workers with little supervision. The rule of St. Benedict, which had once provided a firm standard, was being interpreted loosely or ignored. One critic, writing in the early 1400s, complained that some monks smell more of the world than of the word. Others lamented that monastic homes had become soft, indulging in bathing and linen changes beyond what was needed. Of course, these criticisms reflected shifting values. Some newer monastic orders, like the Franciscans, embraced poverty and filth as marks of humility, rejecting the cleanliness prized by Benedictines. Still, for traditional monasteries, maintaining hygiene was increasingly a matter of reputation, not just piety. Environmental challenges and infrastructure decay. As monasteries aged, so too did their water systems. Stone conduits cracked, Wooden sluices rotted, latrine shafts collapsed, in some cases. Streams changed course, leaving lavatoria dry. Nearby towns polluted water sources, rendering them unsafe. Warfare or land disputes disrupted maintenance. Monks often relied on local peasants or hired laborers to repair these systems, but with limited funds, repairs could be delayed or neglected. In some houses, monks abandoned internal lavatoria and relied on nearby rivers. In others, cesspits were no longer emptied regularly, forcing latrines to be sealed or relocated. This created a visible, literal breakdown of order, a smell in the corridors, a stain on the stone. And for a community that prized physical order as a reflection of divine perfection, that was no small matter. Disease beyond the plague. The Black Death wasn't the only illness to trouble monastic communities. Others included dysentery, often from tainted water or poor latrine conditions. Leprosy, managed in some houses through separate infirmaries or isolation. Skin conditions such as lice, scabies, or fungal infections, exacerbated by poor laundry care. Medical treatises from the time reflect a growing awareness of the connection between dirty clothing, stale air, and illness. Some monasteries responded by building new infirmaries, sometimes detached from main cloisters, introducing stricter laundry schedules, encouraging monks to shave heads more frequently to prevent lice. Still, these efforts were often reactive, not preventative. Cleanliness under strain, discipline under question. By 1450, many monasteries were under scrutiny not only for theological reasons, but for how they appeared to visitors and neighbors. Pilgrims and local bishops sometimes reported unclean cells and filthy bedding, worn garments with holes, lice, or stains, stagnant latrine pits visible from the garden walk, bathing rooms unused for years, full of spiders and dust. In response, some orders doubled down on reform, emphasizing a return to simplicity and routine. Others, under economic pressure, gradually secularized, leasing lands or hiring more lay staff, and slowly transforming into quasi-residences rather than active religious communities. Thus, monastic cleanliness in this period becomes a mirror not just of soap and water, but of a spiritual struggle between discipline and decline, routine and reality, body and soul. And so we return to our core tension. Can a community built on rules maintain its purity when the world changes, and when filth is not only physical, but institutional? By the mid-15th century, many monasteries across Europe were no longer pristine enclaves of discipline and cleanliness. Years of war, plague, neglect, and internal decay had eroded their once exemplary standards. Where once the red order flushed with fresh water and the lavatorium gleamed with ritual cleanliness, there now lay broken pipes, stale air, and in some places silence. And yet, even in decline, these religious communities left behind something enduring. As the medieval world gave way to the early modern period, and the Reformation swept through Europe, monasteries were dissolved, repurposed, or reformed. Their stone walls were turned into schools, prisons, farms, and parish churches. But the monastic ideal that cleanliness mattered not just to the body, but to the order of the soul and the health of the community left a mark that outlived the monks themselves. This final section explores how the hygiene systems, rituals, and spiritual framework of monastic life quietly influenced the broader development of sanitation, medical care, and public health in Europe, even as the cloister doors began to close. The dissolution and the death of monastic order. In the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation radically reshaped the religious landscape of Europe. In England, the dissolution of the monasteries, 1536–1541, under Henry VIII, was one of the most dramatic changes. Over 800 monasteries, priories, and convents were closed and stripped of valuables, dismantled or repurposed, their lands sold to nobles or the crown. Similar movements occurred in Germany, Switzerland, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. Monastic orders were accused of corruption, idleness, and excess. Their emphasis on ritual and cloistered life was rejected in favor of a more personal, scripture-centered faith. But alongside religious critique came the loss of infrastructure. Latrine systems fell into disrepair. Infirmaries were shuttered or secularized. Lavatoria were demolished or turned into kitchens and storage. In Protestant regions, the very idea of spiritual cleanliness through physical ritual was discarded as superstitious. Cleanliness would need a new rationale, one rooted not in holiness, but in health. The survival of monastic medicine. Despite these upheavals, much of the practical knowledge developed in monasteries lived on. Monks had long served as keepers of medical texts, herbalists and apothecaries, managers of infirmaries and hospices. Even in Protestant regions, former monastic hospitals were often reopened under secular or municipal control. The systems of care and cleanliness they developed, such as separating the sick from the healthy, washing bed linens regularly, using latrines instead of open defecation, boiling tools in cloth, persisted and even expanded in civic institutions. In Catholic Europe, monastic orders like the Jesuits and Hospitallers continued to emphasize both spiritual and physical care. Their attention to cleanliness, though still framed in religious language, was increasingly practical, particularly during plague outbreaks. Water engineering and civic sanitation. One of the monastery's greatest legacies was its water engineering. Cistercian monasteries in particular had mastered the art of diverting streams into cloisters, using gravity to power fountains, mills, and waste channels, maintaining aqueducts and stone-lined conduits. After their dissolution, many of these water systems were studied by urban planners and architects. Early modern cities struggling with overcrowding and sanitation began to look backward at monastic models for inspiration. In some cases, monastic drains were repurposed into city sewers. Lavatorium-style hand-washing stations appeared in schools and hospitals. Red order-style latrines informed the design of prisons and army barracks. Thus, the monks' clean habits quietly became part of the architecture of public life. Cleanliness as civic virtue. As Europe moved into the 17th century, cleanliness began to be reimagined not as a religious ideal, but as a civic and moral virtue. Writers and physicians like Thomas Sydenham in England, Girolamo Fracastoro in Italy, Andreas Vesalius in the Low Countries, argued that filth caused disease not because it offended God, but because it harmed the body. The early seeds of germ theory, though centuries away from full flower, began to grow. Hospitals, almshouses, and public bathhouses built during this period often retained monastic design elements, with central courtyards for light and air, running water channels for washing, communal latrines placed away from food stores, rules for cleanliness adapted from monastic schedules. The daily rhythm of cleanliness, once enforced by bells and abbots' rules, was now encoded in early health regulations. From cloister to clinic, the idea of caring for the body as a form of higher responsibility did not vanish, it evolved. In the 17th century, newly founded institutions, orphanages, military hospitals, insane asylums often took their organizational cues from monasteries. Their attention to hygiene, however imperfect, traced a lineage to cloistered practices. In cities like Paris, the Hôtel Dieu retained its monastic origins while modernizing sanitation. Rome, papal hospitals employed monks alongside doctors and secular nurses. Vienna, Jesuit medical schools combined spiritual training with anatomical study. And even the newly emerging medical professions, though increasingly secular, inherited a discipline of cleanliness, a mindset honed over centuries in silent corridors. A quiet influence. Monastic cleanliness never triggered a revolution. There were no grand proclamations, no dramatic shifts in public hygiene because of monks alone. Instead, its influence was quiet, structural, and enduring. It taught generations that clean hands mattered. Water should flow, not stagnate. Waste should be managed, not ignored. Physical discipline reinforced spiritual or moral strength. In an age before microscopes and microbes, monks cultivated the habit of hygiene not as science, but as service. And in doing so, they built the foundation for a world where cleanliness would become not only a personal virtue, but a public good. So we end with one final thought. In an age when filth was normal and death was familiar, monks believed in scrubbing away disorder not just from their hands, but from the world. Could their quiet routines be the unlikely ancestors of our modern quest for cleanliness? Story 7. Bathing like a king, royal cleanliness or perfumed decay. Imagine yourself approaching the chambers of a medieval king or queen. Gold glimmers on embroidered drapes, candlelight flickers on stone walls, peacocks strut in the courtyard below, musicians murmur distant notes. And yet there is a smell, a strong one. Despite the silks, jewels, and incense, the medieval royal court, like the rest of the world, struggled with the question of cleanliness. But the story here is not about mere dirt. It's about how appearances, ritual, and status shaped how kings and queens lived with their bodies. Did kings bathe? Sometimes. Did they care about smelling good? Absolutely. Were they cleaner than peasants? Not always in the ways you'd think. In this section, we peel back the tapestries and perfume clouds to reveal a world where cleanliness was a performance, and the scent of a monarch could be both a political statement and a public scandal. Cleanliness as spectacle. Royal courts were centers of attention. Everything a monarch did was symbolic, including how they looked, smelled, and tended to their body. Cleanliness at court was a sign of divine order, a demonstration of wealth and control, a public ritual, sometimes more important than the result. Bathing, for example, wasn't always private. In some courts, a king's bath was attended by servants, advisors, or even guests. Linen cloths were draped, rose petals scattered, and incense burned. The monarch might be read poetry while being scrubbed. But these were ceremonies, not routines. A royal bath could be months apart, reserved for feast days, weddings, or illnesses. Daily bathing, even for kings, was rare. So how did royalty manage? Perfume, the cloak of kings. Without frequent bathing, royalty turned to perfume not just for beauty, but for health. According to medieval medical theory, based on humorism and miasma, bad smells caused illness. Therefore, pleasant scents were protective. Foul odors were dangerous. This belief drove the use of pomander spheres of scented materials carried or worn, herb-stuffed sachets sewn into clothing, perfumed gloves, fans, and handkerchiefs, scented bathing oils made from myrrh, rose, lavender, and musk. Royalty surrounded themselves with scent not just to smell good, but to ward off disease, signal wealth, and mark themselves as separate from the stench of the common world. Kings of France, for instance, were known to sleep on sheets sprinkled with herbs, while English queens had entire wardrobes scented with civet or ambergris. The royal bath, ritual not routine. Kings and queens did bathe, but not like you might imagine. Baths were large wooden tubs, often padded or lined with cloth, filled with hot water carried by servants, scented with herbs, flowers, or oils, held in heated rooms, or even outdoors in warm weather. Royal bathers were attended by physicians to monitor the body, ladies-in-waiting or valets to assist with washing, musicians for ambience, sometimes clergy for moral oversight. Bathing was considered risky. Heat opened the pores and weakened the body. Therefore, physicians recommended bathing only occasionally, avoiding full immersion, wrapping in warm cloth immediately afterward. Some monarchs bathed once a month, others far less. The Hungarian King Louis I was praised in the 14th century for bathing once a week, an unusually high standard. But for many, the effort, labor, and risk meant that bathing was occasional, ritualized, and impractical. Hair, hands, and hygiene. Daily hygiene at court focused more on surface maintenance. Royalty had dedicated barbers to shave and trim beards, manicurists to clean and polish fingernails, tooth powders made of ground herbs, chalk, or ash, special combs for lice, a common nuisance, even in palaces. Clean linen was key. Since changing clothes was easier than washing the body, royalty changed garments often sometimes multiple times a day. In many courts, kings wore fresh undergarments each morning. Queens had bed linen changed weekly. Servants were assigned to air out clothing daily. This practice created an illusion of cleanliness, even when the skin beneath remained unwashed. The role of servants. Behind every well-scented monarch was a team of servants who handled chamber pots and privies, laundry and linen management, bath preparation and water heating, scented cloths and wardrobe rotation. In the English royal household, positions like the groom of the stool were responsible not only for assisting with toileting, but for monitoring the king's health through his waste. Though joked about today, such roles were prestigious, granting intimate access to the monarch and influence in court politics. Filth in the palace. Despite the trappings of luxury, royal courts could be disgustingly dirty. Palaces were vast and hard to maintain. Stone floors were covered with rushes or straw, which soaked up spills and bodily fluids. Food scraps dropped during meals. Animal waste from hunting dogs or horses kept nearby. Privies were limited. Chamber pots were used frequently. Servants emptied them into nearby cesspits or streams, or sometimes out of windows. One English chronicler wrote of Henry VII's court, "The air within the galleries is oft foul and rank." In other words, despite silk curtains and rosewater, even kings lived with the smell of human life. Cleanliness as class symbol. Ultimately, in royal courts, cleanliness wasn't about being clean, it was about looking clean. Fine clothing covered body odor. Perfume masked infrequent bathing. Scented gloves concealed sweaty palms. Public displays of washing hands before meals replaced private ablutions. These habits created a culture of performance, where the appearance of purity mattered more than its reality. And while peasants scrubbed themselves in streams or rivers out of necessity, royalty often avoided such basic practices out of fear, tradition, or sheer impracticality. So as you picture the medieval monarch crowned, robed, perfumed, remember what lay beneath. Clean hands, perhaps, scented hair likely, but behind the layers of velvet and incense, a body rarely washed, wrapped instead in ritual, reputation, and the strange politics of smell. Which raises the question: if kings avoided bathing, how did royalty ever confront the more pressing challenges of health and cleanliness during times of illness, marriage, or diplomacy? In the grand halls of medieval and Renaissance courts, where power was projected in silks, scepters, and ceremonies, personal hygiene remained a curiously complicated affair. As we've seen, royalty often avoided daily bathing, favoring perfumes and ritualized washing instead. But there were certain moments when cleanliness wasn't just symbolic, it became urgent. Whether preparing for a politically strategic marriage, hosting foreign dignitaries, or fighting off a fever, Kings and queens were sometimes forced to face the limits of perfume and pageantry. In those moments, water-hot, herbal, and carefully managed returned to the royal body. Cleanliness in these rare cases became both a tool and a test. This section explores how the great courts of Europe dealt with these moments of necessity, when the body of a monarch had to be not only dressed and scented, but truly cleaned. Diplomatic cleanliness, smell and statecraft. In an era where diplomacy was conducted face-to-face and appearance was everything, royal hygiene could influence international relations. A foul-smelling king was more than a personal embarrassment, it was a symbolic threat to his realm's reputation. Chroniclers occasionally noted these concerns. In 15th century Burgundy, the court of Philip the Good took great pains to appear opulent and well-groomed before ambassadors, including fresh laundering of all tapestries and public clothing. In Spain, the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, reportedly bathed before receiving foreign visitors not out of personal habit, but because of the political stakes. Clean hands and scented gloves were standard, but when a royal bride or ambassador was expected, it wasn't unusual for the monarch to undergo a rare full bath, complete with hair washing and linen changes. Perfume, already a daily part of court life, took on diplomatic weight with court apothecaries, crafting special fragrances for events and visits. Marriage and the bath before the bed. Perhaps nowhere was cleanliness more necessary or more ritualized than in the royal marriage chamber. Before the consummation of a marriage, especially one with political importance, both bride and groom were bathed in scented water, dressed in fresh linen or ceremonial robes, sometimes anointed with oils for health and fertility. This practice served several purposes. It was believed to purify the body, preventing disease. It symbolized new beginnings, a washing away of past impurities. It reinforced the idea that marriage, especially for monarchs, was not just personal, but sacred and political. In 1469, the wedding of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon included such rituals, though the frequency of actual full-body washing remains debated. Similarly, Catherine de' Medici, when marrying Henry II of France in 1533, was accompanied by Italian perfumers and bath attendants who oversaw her hygiene in the days before the ceremony. These preparations were both practical and strategic, designed to make a favorable impression in a foreign court. Illness, sweat, and the therapeutic bath. When monarchs fell ill, as they often did, hygiene took on a new role: medicine. According to prevailing medical theories, disease could be drawn out through sweat, balanced by managing bodily humors, prevented or treated through cleansing rituals. Thus, when royalty were sick, sweat baths, saunas, or steam rooms were sometimes used. Hot herbal soaks were prescribed by court physicians. Scented compresses and ointments were applied to affected areas. Bed linens were changed more frequently, sometimes daily. One famous example is Henry IV of France, who reportedly bathed only sparingly but underwent medicinal washing during periods of fever. In some courts, monarchs were wrapped in warm towels after bathing, with servants assisting in drying, dressing, and soothing the patient with rosewater. Though the effectiveness of these treatments was limited, they demonstrated a recognition, however rudimentary, that cleanliness mattered in healing, even when it was neglected in health. Queenly cleanliness and public scrutiny. While kings could often hide their filth behind power and protocol, queens were held to higher and harsher standards. Women's bodies were thought to be more permeable, more susceptible to odors, more morally vulnerable to impurity. As a result, queens were often expected to maintain a higher degree of outward cleanliness, especially during pregnancy and childbirth, public appearances, court celebrations. In 16th century France, Queen Marguerite of Valois was both praised for her beauty and rumored to spend extravagant sums on perfumes and linen. Her attendants reportedly changed her chemise multiple times a day. By contrast, rumors of poor hygiene could become political weapons. Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, was accused by her enemies of having unpleasant body odor, a likely fabrication, but one that carried moral overtones. Even in private, queens were attended by ladies-in-waiting who monitored their hygiene closely. Bathing, when it occurred, was semi-public, carried out in curtained spaces with multiple observers. Cleanliness, in other words, was not just a personal matter for queens, it was a state performance. Royal children, wash with caution. Royal children, especially heirs, were treated with both reverence and paranoia. Hygiene was part of this care, but so were misunderstandings about health. Infants and toddlers were rarely bathed, perhaps once a month, wiped down with rosewater or linen cloths, dressed in layers of clean but seldom washed swaddling. Physicians advised against full immersion baths for bobbies, fearing they would weaken the constitution, allow bad airs to enter through open pores, lead to colds, fevers, or worse. Instead, nurses used warming pans, herbal sachets, and constant layering to manage hygiene. Despite the high infant mortality rate, these practices persisted, shaped more by tradition than observation. Behind the perfume, what they feared. Royal reluctance to bathe wasn't laziness, it was fear. Doctors believed that water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable. Bathing could weaken the heart or drown the spirits. Overbathing was a sign of vanity or indulgence. Thus, bathing was used only when directed by physicians, when demanded by diplomacy or ritual, when unavoidable due to illness. This fear was reinforced by anecdote stories of noblewomen who bathed too often and died, or kings who fell ill after a plunge in cold water. So royalty chose instead to disguise, mask, and manage their hygiene. In effect, they bathed in symbols. So even in the moments when cleanliness was necessary, marriage, diplomacy, sickness, the royal approach remained cautious, ceremonial, and bound by fear. It was not about health as we know it today, but about managing appearances, risk, and social expectations. But this leads to one final question for the story's end. How did the arrival of the Renaissance, with its rediscovery of classical ideals, reshape royal attitudes toward the body, and did kings and queens finally learn to love the bath? By the dawn of the 16th century, a quiet transformation was bubbling beneath the marble floors of Europe's royal palaces, not just in art and architecture, but in attitudes toward the human body. The Renaissance, that wide-reaching revival of classical knowledge and aesthetics, was reshaping how people thought about health, hygiene, and the self. As monarchs now commissioned portraits with bare shoulders and sculptors shaped bodies in alabaster and bronze, the very idea of the unwashed royal body, perfumed but festering, began to lose its luster. Cleanliness, long treated with suspicion, was being reimagined as virtue, beauty, and modernity. Yet this transformation did not happen overnight. It was layered, inconsistent, and often contradicted by old fears and habits. In this final section, we examine how Renaissance ideas about anatomy, health, and classical luxury led some monarchs to embrace bathing again, while others clung stubbornly to powder, pomanders, and public appearances. Classical echoes, Romans reborn. One of the defining traits of the Renaissance was its reverence for antiquity. The baths of ancient Rome, once dismissed as decadent or heretical, were now celebrated as symbols of civilized life. Royal scholars and courtiers began to read ancient medical texts that praised bathing and exercise, decorate palaces with frescoes of Venus at her bath or Apollo in repose, restore and imitate classical bath architecture with vaulted ceilings and mosaic floors. This ideological shift was especially strong in Italy, where city-states like Florence, Venice, and Rome were rediscovering the luxurious bathing practices of the Caesars. Some monarchs, eager to show themselves as enlightened, began commissioning private bathhouses, complete with heated floors, scented steam rooms, and marble tubs. Yet these remained exclusive indulgences, not daily routines. Bathing was still for special moments, illness, ceremony, or romantic display. Royal bathing returned, a cautious embrace. Several monarchs of the Renaissance era became known, sometimes reluctantly, for their return to bathing. Francis I of France, r. 1515–1547, was deeply influenced by Italian culture. He built elaborate private baths at Fontainebleau and was said to bathe several times a month, which shocked some courtiers and delighted others. Queen Elizabeth I of England, r. 1558–1603, reportedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, according to court gossip. She favored perfumed oils and had a silver basin installed in her quarters, attended by her ladies. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, had a personal bathhouse near his palace in Yuste, Spain, complete with heating systems and a garden view, though he still avoided full immersion and preferred washing by parts. Yet old habits died hard. Many nobles still feared the bath, believing it weakened the body or invited disease. Even as physicians cautiously advocated more regular washing, the tension between classical ideals and medieval caution remained. The apothecary's influence. The real shift toward cleaner habits in this period may owe more to the rise of professional apothecaries and physicians than to royal whim. Doctors of the late 16th and early 17th centuries studied anatomy with growing accuracy, advocated moderate bathing, especially for skin ailments, produced herbal oil, soaps, and tonics for washing. Apothecaries in royal courts began crafting tooth powders with mint, sage, and crushed coral, scented soaps from olive oil and lye, balms for hair and skin that required washing for proper use. This helped change attitudes. If health depended on removing impurities, then clean skin, hair, and clothing were no longer just aesthetic choices, they were part of the royal regimen. Perfume and powder still reign. Despite this gradual shift, the 17th century remained a time of mixed practices. In France, the court of Louis XIV at Versailles became the epitome of elegance and excess, but not necessarily of hygiene. Louis famously preferred dry washing with linen cloths and perfumes over immersion in water. His palace had few functional bathrooms, and chamber pots overflowed behind the gilded walls. Still, the Sun King employed an army of perfumers and apothecaries to maintain appearances. Perfumed wigs were powdered daily. Hands were rubbed with aromatic alcohols. Laced gloves were soaked in orange blossom water. Rooms were sprayed with rose and lavender essences. It was cleanliness without contact, ritual without water. The illusion of hygiene remained more important than its reality. Queenly trends, beauty and bathing. Royal women of the Renaissance and Baroque periods increasingly linked bathing with beauty. In Italy, France, and Spain, queens and princesses were advised to bathe gently with milk, wine, or floral infusions. Wash their faces with herbal rinses each morning. Keep their hands and nails pristine with almond oil. Cosmetic manuals of the time, some written for noblewomen, advocated regular cleansing. Bathing, once feared, became a status-enhancing luxury, especially when done in ornate surroundings. Yet again, these practices were often partial. Full-body immersion was rare. More often, queens washed their hands, arms, face, and feet, a practice known as ablution by parts, conducted in private by attendants. Architecture of cleanliness. As hygiene gained cultural ground, palace architecture began to reflect this change. New royal residences included private washrooms, often with running water from rooftop cisterns, marble bathtubs, sometimes sunken into the floor, separate dressing and bathing chambers, reflecting new ideas of privacy. In the palaces of Florence, Vienna, and Madrid, visitors noted these innovations as signs of modernity and refinement. Even public bathhouses, once closed under moral suspicion, began to return in cities frequented not by peasants alone, but by traveling nobles and wealthy merchants. Cleanliness and power, the final transition. By the end of the 17th century, royal attitudes toward bathing had changed not entirely, but significantly. Bathing was now a symbol of elegance, not just fear, tied to science, beauty, and architecture, seen as part of courtly etiquette, especially for women. The king's body, once wrapped in linens and scent alone, now occasionally touched soap and warm water not as punishment or medicine, but as indulgence and identity. Cleanliness, in short, had become a new kind of power, a way to project intelligence, control, and superiority in the changing world of absolutism and enlightenment. But still, most kings bathed less than once a month. So what does this tell us? That even among royalty, the journey to modern hygiene was slow, halting, and uneven. Cleanliness was not discovered, it was negotiated, between ritual, science, and style. And behind every powdered wig and perfumed glove was a story of resistance, reform, and the eternal question: how clean is clean enough when you rule the world? Story 8, Soap and Soot, the forgotten guilds that kept cities sort of clean. As Europe's cities began to grow in the high Middle Ages, so did the waste. Refuse spilled into alleys. Cesspits frothed under timbered homes. Chimneys choked with soot. Tanners, butchers, and dyers dumped filth into rivers. And yet, amid all this organic chaos, a quiet force emerged, not glamorous, rarely remembered, but absolutely vital: the urban cleaning guilds. These were the soapers, sweepers, fullers, scavengers, and nightsel men who performed the least poetic but most essential tasks of medieval civilization. They scrubbed, boiled, hauled, and swept. Their trades were smelly, dirty, and often looked down upon. But without them, the growing urban centers of Europe would have collapsed under their own filth. In this section, we'll step into the cobbled streets and crooked alleys of medieval cities to explore how cleanliness was kept not by kings or priests, but by anonymous hands working in guild halls, soap vats, and back alleys. A city of smells. To understand the world these workers inhabited, imagine a walk through a 13th century European town, say, London, Bruges, or Florence. The air is thick with animal dung, wood smoke, urine, and the sour tang of rotting food. Butcher stalls spill blood into the gutters. Tanneries reek of lime and manure. Open sewers run down the middle of the street. Latrines are rare. Chamber pots are emptied from windows with a shouted gardaloo. This was the baseline, the background hum of city life. People were used to it, but they weren't indifferent. They noticed filth, they smelled rot, and they complained. Municipal records from the 12th and 13th centuries are filled with ordinances, fines, and complaints. Against tanners for polluting rivers. Against residents who let pigs roam freely. Against neighbors who let waste pile up by doorways. Someone had to deal with this, and that someone was the emerging class of urban sanitation workers. The soapers, crafting cleanliness. Soap in its simplest form is a mixture of fat and alkali, often lye, made from wood ash. The Soapers Guild took this basic formula and turned it into a rough but essential product for washing hands, wool, linens, and occasionally skin. By the 13th century, soap makers had formed guilds in cities like Marseille, where olive oil was used to make softer, more fragrant soap. Naples, with its blend of animal tallow and wood ash. Barcelona, exporting soaps across the Mediterranean. In Northern Europe, soap was often harder, greasier, and made from animal fat less pleasant but effective. Soapers worked near water sources and markets, their workshops, boiled large vats of fat and lye, emitted strong smells, required careful temperature control to avoid explosions or burns. Soap wasn't cheap. The poor used sand, ash, or clay to scrub themselves, but soap makers became important guild members, especially as cities grew and more cloth, linen, and wool needed washing. The sweepers and scavengers. Most cities employed a class of street sweepers, though not always formally. Their jobs included sweeping public streets and market squares, removing horse manure and food scraps, clearing ash from fires and workshops, occasionally pushing waste into rivers or pits. In wealthier areas, sweepers were paid by wealthy merchants or the city council. Elsewhere, they worked for tips or scraped by selling rags and bones they collected. Scavengers, a term derived from medieval scavenge, tax collectors, eventually became the word for those who hauled waste from cesspits and latrines. Their work was physically dangerous and socially degrading but critical. Some cities required each household to sweep in front of their door. Failing to do so could result in a fine. But enforcement varied, and sweepers often faced overwhelming volume. The Neitzel men. One of the least enviable jobs was that of the Neitzel man, responsible for emptying cesspits and privies, usually under cover of darkness. Cesspits were dug beneath homes, latrines, or communal courtyards, lined with stone or brick, sometimes, meant to slowly absorb waste, but often overflowed. When full, the contents, known as Neitzel, had to be removed with buckets, scoops, and sheer determination. Neitzel men worked by lantern light, hauled waste in carts to designated dumps or farms, were often ostracized socially, despite being vital. In cities like London, records from the 14th century refer to designated lay stalls, dung heaps, and filth carriers. Regulations began to appear about where Neitzel could be dumped and where it could not. Guilds and regulation. Many of these jobs eventually formed guilds or trade associations, especially in larger cities. These guilds trained apprentices, set prices and standards, petitioned city councils for privileges, enforced zoning laws, keeping noxious trades in certain areas. In Paris, Florence, and Milan, guilds of fullers, soap makers, and leatherworkers were closely monitored because of their smells and waste. But these guilds also had political power. They could hire guards to protect their facilities, sue neighbors for pollution, influence laws about sanitation. Despite their low status, they were organized, essential, and persistent. The cost of clean. Maintaining urban cleanliness was expensive. City councils funded sweeping crews and dump maintenance. Guilds paid for waste removal services. Residents were taxed for street cleaning and cesspit upkeep. When funds ran short, streets clogged with waste. In times of war or famine, sanitation collapsed entirely. Plague years, in particular, overwhelmed these systems. Sweepers fled. Neitzel men died or refused to work. Streets became navigable only by raised wooden planks as waste piled high. And yet, after the worst passed, the guilds returned. The stink never truly left, but the infrastructure limped along. As we close this section, one must wonder, what did it feel like to spend your life scrubbing, scooping, and boiling other people's waste for a city that barely acknowledged your work, yet collapsed without it? As European cities sprawled upward and outward during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the matter of managing urban filth became more urgent and more contested. The trades that specialized in cleansing soapers, fullers, scavengers, chimney sweeps, Neitzel men gained visibility, even if not respect. At the same time, the politics of waste intensified. In this era, cleanliness became a point of pride, a battleground of bureaucracy and even a trade secret. The soap maker guarded his recipe like a king's vault. The sweeper fought the tanner for space in the alley. The city council battled everyone over who should pay for it all. In this section, we step deeper into the socio-political dynamics of the forgotten hygiene guilds and their increasingly complex relationship with urban life between the 15th and 17th centuries. The story is one of innovation, regulation, and resistance, often at the same time. The soap wars, competition, secrecy, and status. By the 15th century, soap making was no longer just a cottage craft, it had become an international business. Cities like Marseille, Savona, and Alicante exported olive oil-based Castile soap. London and Bristol developed tallow-based soaps for home and industrial use. German towns produced coarse soap for wool and linens. As demand rose, so did rivalries. Soap recipes were considered closely guarded secrets. Guilds enacted strict apprenticeship contracts to prevent espionage. Cities issued patents or monopolies to favored producers. In England, soap making became so profitable that Queen Elizabeth I in the late 16th century began taxing it heavily, eventually granting a monopoly to royal favorites. This led to price inflation, black market soap, and public complaints. The soapmakers' guilds defended their turf fiercely. They sued those who made soap without a license. They accused rivals of adulterating soap with chalk or animal blood. They lobbied councils to ban inferior foreign soaps. Soap had become more than hygiene, it was identity, power, and property. Fullers and the battle for water. Another vital cleaning guild was the fullers' craftsmen who cleaned, thickened, and finished woolen cloth. Fulling involved soaking cloth in a mixture of water and fuller's earth or urine, trampling or beating the cloth to remove grease and dirt, rinsing in flowing water, often downstream from mills or tanneries. Fullers were water-intensive and highly territorial. They fought for access to clean streams and rivers. They resisted sharing waterways with dyers or tanners, whose waste ruined wool. They frequently clashed with local residents over the stench of urine-soaked cloth. Cities like Florence and Ghent were infamous for these disputes. In some cases, fullers walled off sections of rivers. In others, fights broke out in public over diverted channels. Despite their pungent trade, fullers were economically powerful, providing finished goods for booming textile markets. Their guilds were among the oldest and wealthiest, and they wielded real political influence in some city councils. Chimney sweeps, child labor, and early air pollution. As buildings grew taller and winters grew colder, cities filled with chimney smoke. But clogged chimneys didn't just darken skies, they caused fires and deadly backdrafts of smoke into homes. Enter the chimney sweeps, an emerging guild in the late 15th century. Their work involved climbing narrow chimney flues, removing soot, creosote, and animal nests, often done by young boys, whose size allowed access to tight spaces. These children, sometimes orphans, sometimes sold by poor families, worked in dangerous, soot-choked conditions, often suffering from respiratory illnesses, burn injuries, soot wart, a form of occupational cancer. Despite this, the trade was tolerated if not regulated. The presence of a chimney sweep became associated with fire safety and luck, even as the workers themselves were often viewed as semi-invisible laborers. Early cities tried to manage air pollution with laws limiting chimney smoke, but enforcement was weak. As coal replaced wood in some cities, notably London by the 1600s, the soot only worsened. The soot problem wouldn't fully be addressed until the 19th century, but its roots were here, in a world where cleaning the air was left to boys with brushes and no shoes. The economics of waste. One surprising development in this period was the emergence of waste as a commodity. Organic waste, especially from humans and animals, was in demand. Farmers purchased nitzel for fertilizer. Tanners used dog feces, pure, to soften hides. Dyers used urine to fix colors. City councils began auctioning rights to collect waste from certain areas, leasing cesspit cleanout contracts to scavenger guilds, licensing midden masters to manage dumps and dung heaps. In Amsterdam, Bruges, and London, the most organized scavenger companies became semi-corporate hearing teams, running carts and negotiating with both city and private clients. This led to conflicts of interest. Should waste be removed quickly or sold for profit? Should the city subsidize cleanliness or tax it? Urban sanitation was no longer just about health, it was a financial game, with winners and losers. Rules, fines, and loopholes. To keep the city livable and politically stable, councils wrote a growing number of sanitation ordinances. Fines for dumping waste outside designated hours. Rules requiring waste to be dumped outside city walls. Regulations about soap quality and water access. But enforcement was inconsistent. Records from Nuremberg, Paris, and York reveal residents bribing sweepers to ignore infractions. Soapers who secretly dumped live waste into wells. Nitzel men who unloaded carts into rivers during the night. Still, the existence of these rules shows that cleanliness had become a public concern, not just a private burden. Ritual and reputation. Guilds, for all their grime, tried to maintain honor and trust. Many required clean uniforms or aprons, participation in religious festivals and processions, oaths of ethical behavior. The Soapers of London, for instance, marched annually on the feast of St. Thomas à Becket. The Fullers of Ghent sponsored a chapel. Even the Nitzel men of Prague formed a brotherhood that prayed for one another's health and salvation. Why? Because their reputations mattered. Cleanliness, paradoxically, gave these dirty trades a kind of moral clarity. They served the city, they kept order, they prevented rot, even if they reeked. By 1600, the guilds that once scrubbed behind the scenes were now deeply embedded in city life, essential, organized, often invisible, but always present. And yet change was coming. With the rise of centralized governments, scientific medicine, and urban planning, these guilds would soon face a challenge to their authority. Sanitation would become a matter not of trade, but of policy. But before that revolution, there remained one final question. Could a world of sweepers and soapers survive the arrival of modern hygiene, or would the guilds that built cleanliness be swept away themselves? By the dawn of the 17th century, cities were louder, denser, and smellier than ever before. From the gutters of Naples to the alleyways of Edinburgh, the old methods of managing waste, guild-organized scavenging, ritualized sweeping, piecemeal cesspit cleanouts were struggling to keep pace with urban growth. For centuries, cleanliness had been the work of craftsmen. Soapers, scavengers, fullers, and chimney sweeps operated as guilds, tradespeople with tools, apprentices, and time-tested methods. But as urban life strained under the pressure of population, disease, and industry, a new idea was forming. Cleanliness was not merely a craft, it was a public responsibility. In this final section, we witness the decline of the old hygiene guilds, their absorption or obliteration by new systems of governance and infrastructure. What emerges is a story of conflict between tradition and modernity, secrecy and science, craft and bureaucracy. The plague that broke the system. The Black Death in the 14th century had already challenged medieval cleanliness, but later plagues, especially those of the 17th century, exposed the limits of the guild model. In the London Plague of 1665, Nitzel men fled or died, leaving cesspits overflowing. Sweepers were pressed into corpse removal duties. The city attempted to impose quarantines and burning of waste, but lacked the centralized structure to enforce it. A similar collapse occurred in Marseille, 1720, during its final plague outbreak. Waste workers, already marginalized, were either overwhelmed or refused to work due to fear of infection. City officials increasingly realized that relying on independent guilds with their own schedules, secrets, and priorities was no longer viable in times of crisis. The rise of the bureaucrats. In response, many European cities began forming municipal sanitation boards, staffed not by craftsmen, but by clerks, surveyors, and early urban planners. These boards issued citywide regulation for cesspit construction, created schedules for street cleaning, licensed and monitored chimney sweeps and waste collectors, employed inspectors to ensure compliance. In Amsterdam, the early 18th century saw the creation of a dedicated sanitation office. In Paris, the Bureau de la Voirie standardized urban waste removal and fined violators. Vienna, Berlin, and Venice followed suit. The language shifted too, no longer sweepers or scavengers, but sanitation officers. Public hygiene became a field of study, and its control passed into the hands of the educated, not the experienced. Soap becomes scientific. As soap-making evolved, it too slipped from the guild's grasp. In the 18th century, scientific chemistry transformed soap from artisanal product to industrial commodity. In 1791, French chemist Nicolas Leblanc developed a method to synthesize soda ash, a key ingredient, making soap cheaper and more scalable. Soap-making became standardized, with printed recipes and controlled measurements. Factories in England, France, and Germany produced soap in quantities the old guilds could not match. The guilds of soapers found themselves outpaced. Their hand-cut bars couldn't compete with factory-stamped goods. Their apprenticeships were deemed outdated. Their legal protections were eroded by central governments eager for tax, revenue, and efficiency. Soap, once the mark of a city guild, became the symbol of a modern household, sold by the bar, wrapped in paper, and endorsed by doctors. Chimney sweeps and child labor reform. Of all the hygiene trades, chimney sweeping remained the most visibly problematic. Despite increasing public discomfort, the industry relied heavily on child labor, often children as young as 5. Climbing narrow flues, sleeping in soot-stained clothes, living under the care of master sweeps, often abusive. By the late 1700s, reformers in Britain and Germany began advocating for change. Early laws were weak, but public campaigns intensified. Pamphlets described the brutal conditions. Artists sketched emaciated sweep boys, evoking pity. Some cities began offering mechanical brushes as an alternative. The Chimney Sweeps Guild, once a legitimate body of trained cleaners, became a symbol of backwardness and cruelty, an uncomfortable relic of an older world. The end of guild authority. By the late 18th century, the hygiene guilds were in steep decline. Apprenticeships dried up. Municipal contracts were nationalized. Their economic niches were taken by machines, centralized institutions, and capitalist entrepreneurs. In some cities, guilds were outright abolished. The French Revolution dissolved all guilds in 1791, viewing them as barriers to freedom and economic progress. In Prussia, royal decrees stripped guilds of authority. In London, the final remnants of the scavenger guilds were absorbed into the city's sanitary commission by the early 1800s. The very identity of these trades shifted. From craft to labor. From guild member to municipal employee or factory worker. From community tradition to institutional bureaucracy. What was lost, what was gained? The collapse of the hygiene guilds brought white heavy checkmark, more standardized sanitation. White heavy checkmark, better public health outcomes, eventually. White heavy checkmark lower soap prices and higher availability. White heavy checkmark decreased reliance on child labor. But it also meant cross-mark loss of local knowledge and informal networks. Cross-mark disempowerment of once respected craftspeople. Cross-mark centralization that often ignored on-the-ground conditions. The guild system was flawed, but it had rooted hygiene in community. Sweepers knew their streets. Soapers served their neighbors. Scavengers understood the rhythms of their city. By contrast, modern sanitation, though more effective, became impersonal, bureaucratic, and hidden behind walls. A final reflection. We remember kings and castles. We celebrate doctors and inventors. But the soapers, scavengers, fullers, and sweeps, those who made cities livable long before running water or flushing toilets, fade into obscurity. And yet without them, there would have been no cities to govern, no gowns to parade, no palaces worth approaching. So next time you lather a bar of soap or flush a toilet, consider the legacy of the guilds that scrubbed in the shadows for centuries. They didn't build cathedrals. They kept the street beneath them from collapsing under the weight of its own filth.